Lenora didn't even look up from her teacup when she said it. Be gone before sunrise. I won't say it twice. 18 years old. 260 pounds. $17 in a cracked leather pouch. And a stepmother who slid a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table like she was returning a library book, a deed to nothing. A receipt for a life they'd already decided didn't belong there anymore. Mara Whitlock picked up that paper. Read it once. Set it back down. Then she walked to the shed, lifted her grandfather's tool bag onto her shoulder, and stepped out into the dark without a single word. Because some things some people don't beg. What happened next on Blackthorn Ridge would take a full year to unfold. And when it was over, every single person who watched that girl walk away with nothing would have to live with what they chose not to see. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel don't let go easy. And before you go, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night Mara Whitlock turned 18, her father made pot roast. That was the part she'd remember longest, not the words, not Lenora's face, not even the piece of paper. The pot roast. Because Raymond Whitlock had cooked exactly 3 meals in the 8 years since Mara's mother died, and all 3 had been performative. Occasions where food stood in for something he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. Mara sat at the table that evening knowing something was coming. She'd known for weeks. The way animals know weather, not from looking at the sky, but from feeling the pressure shift in their bones. Lenora had been quieter than usual. Raymond had been careful, which was worse than quiet. Careful meant he'd already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to announce it as though it were mutual. The pot roast was the moment. We've sold the house, Raymond said, cutting his meat with surgical precision, not looking at her. Closing's at the end of the month. Lenora and I are moving to Benson Creek. There's a smaller place there, more appropriate. For he paused. Selected the word the way a man selects a tool he's afraid might break something. Our situation. Mara watched him chew. Our situation, she repeated. That was when Lenora finally entered the conversation. Lenora did not set down her fork, did not look away from her own plate. Simply said, as though reading from a grocery list, "You're 18 now, a grown woman. It's time you made your own arrangements." The phrase "made your own arrangements" landed in the room like a dropped axe. Mara was not stupid. She understood what was being offered. Nothing. She understood that the paper Lenora slid across the table, the one with the crabbed official handwriting and the counthouse seal pressed into the corner, was not a gift. It was a door being closed and locked from the other side. She picked it up anyway. The Rourke claim. 42 acres on Blackthorn Ridge, including a derelict mining dugout and the surrounding summit land. Purchased by the county at tax auction 6 years prior and sitting unclaimed ever since because no one had wanted it badly enough to pay the back fees. The transfer amount was listed at $15. That's not a home, Mara said. No, Lenora agreed. But it's land. And land is more than most people get. Raymond finally looked up, and in his face Mara saw the thing she'd spent years trying to find, and years trying to deny. Not cruelty. Exactly. Not hatred. Something worse. Discomfort. The expression of a man who had looked at his own daughter and found her inconvenient. He reached into his breast pocket and set a small pouch on the table beside the deed. There's $17 in there. It ought to be enough to get you started somewhere. Somewhere. Mara stared at that pouch for a long time. Long enough that the silence became something physical, something that pressed against the walls of the kitchen and made Lenora shift in her seat and made Raymond look back down at his plate. Then Mara stood up, took the pouch, took the deed, and walked out of the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not ask why, because she already knew why, and knowing why didn't require discussion. Lenora found Mara's body an embarrassment. She'd made that clear. In a dozen small ways over 4 years. The way she'd refer to Mara as heavyset in company. The way she'd set portions at dinner that implied a project rather than a meal. The way she'd steered Raymond away from any conversation about Mara's future, as though the future were a room they'd agreed to stop entering. And Raymond had let her. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not Lenora's coldness. Lenora had never pretended to love her. But Raymond had. Raymond had stood at a funeral 3 years ago and held Mara's hand while they buried Gideon Whitlock, her grandfather, and said, "I've got you, Mara. I promise." And then he'd spent the next 3 years quietly dismantling that promise, one dinner table silence at a time, until it was nothing but $17 in a cracked leather pouch and a deed to a mountain nobody wanted. Mara went to the shed. Gideon's tools were still there because nobody had thought to take them. A canvas bag containing a stone hammer, 2 chisels, a hand level, a folding rule, a small pry bar, and a whetstone wrapped in oilcloth. The tools were old. The canvas was patched in 3 places. The wooden handles were smooth from decades of use, worn down to the exact shape of Gideon's grip, which meant they didn't quite fit Mara's hands the same way, a fact she'd always found strangely comforting, like borrowing someone else's well-loved coat. She took the tools. She took the wool blanket from the hook inside the shed door. She took the fossil stone from the shelf above the workbench, a piece of pale granite with the impression of a fern pressed into its surface. The kind of thing that looked like nothing until you held it up to light, and then looked ancient and permanent and impossible. Gideon had given it to her when she was 9. "Feel how heavy it is," he'd said. "That's time. You're holding about 40 million years right now." She'd laughed at him. He'd smiled and set it in her palm and said, "Nothing worth having is ever light, Mara. Remember that." She put the fossil in the canvas bag with the tools. Then she walked north. The road out of town was empty at that hour, which was just as well. Mara had grown up in Red Willow Crossing and knew most of the faces that occupied it, and she had no interest in those faces tonight. Most of its windows were dark. She knew what they looked like when they saw her coming, the careful blankness that slid over people's expressions when they were trying not to look at her body and were therefore looking at nothing else. She'd learned to read that blankness the way Gideon had taught her to read stone. There were fracture lines in it, if you knew where to look. She walked until the town was behind her, and the road became a track, and the track became a trail. Blackthorn Ridge rose ahead of her in the dark, a long, ragged spine of rock and pine against a sky still freckled with late stars. The trail switchbacked up through spruce and fir, steep enough that Mara had to use her hands on the worst sections, the canvas bag clanking against her back with every step. Her body was not built for speed on terrain like this. She knew that, no. She'd known it her whole life, had it pointed out in ways ranging from clinical to cruel by doctors, by schoolmates, by Lenora's carefully calibrated size. Her weight made the ascent punishing in ways it simply wasn't for lighter people. Her knees ached by the first switchback. Her lungs burned by the second. By the third, she had stopped and was leaning against a pine with both hands on her thighs, breathing hard enough that she could hear it echoing off the rocks. She did not turn around. She knew something that people who'd only ever seen her body tended to miss. She was extraordinarily strong. Not gym strong, not performance strong, but load-bearing strong, the kind of strength that comes from spending years carrying significant weight everywhere you go. Her legs were pillars. Her back was a cable bridge. She could lift things that surprised people. She could work for hours without stopping if she paced herself correctly. Gideon had understood this. "You're built like the mountains themselves." He'd told her once, and it had been the kindest thing anyone ever said to her, not because it was flattery, but because he'd meant it as engineering, as fact, as a description of actual structural capacity. She pushed off the tree and kept climbing. The sun was still 2 hours below the horizon when she reached the summit. The Rourke claim looked exactly as bad as she'd expected, which was to say, worse than anything she'd hoped. A dugout built into the north face of the ridge, its roof partially collapsed inward, its doorway buried under a decade of debris-fallen timber, packed earth, the skeletal remnants of what might once have been a storage lean-to. The stone walls were standing. That was the best thing she could say about it. The walls were standing, and they were thick, and whoever had laid them had known what they were doing. The mortar joints were tight, even after all these years, and the corners built were square, and the foundation courses were level, in a way that amateur builders rarely managed. Mara walked the perimeter in the first gray light, one hand trailing along the stones. She felt the fractures, the weak points, the places where frost had worked its way into joints and expanded and pushed mortar loose. She felt the sections that were solid and load-bearing and would need nothing more than cleaning. She tapped stones the way Gideon had taught her, listening to the sound change beneath her knuckle, the dull thud of compromised material versus the clean ring of sound rock. Most of it rang clean. She sat down on a boulder with the canvas bag between her feet and the deed in her hand, and the fossil stone in her jacket pocket, and she looked out at the valley below her, where Red Willow Crossing was just beginning to show its first kitchen lights, small and orange in the blue distance. $17. She counted them. 4 silver dollars, 11 paper singles, and 8 coins of mixed denomination. Counted them twice, because she was thorough by nature, and because she wanted to be absolutely certain of what she had before she decided what to do with it. Then she folded the deed, put it in the canvas bag with the tools, and lay down on the flat boulder with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She slept for 4 hours. When she woke, the sun was full up, and the valley was bright, and she was cold and stiff, and her shoulders ached from the straps of the canvas bag, and she sat up and looked at the ruined dugout and thought, where do I start? Not can I do this, not should I. Just where do I start? That was Gideon in her, right down to the phrasing. Gideon had never been a man who dwelt in doubt about practical problems. He'd stood in front of collapsed chimneys and crumbling retaining walls and flooded basements with that same expression, not cheerful, not false optimistic, just assessing, just reading the problem the way you read a page, looking for where the logic began. Everything broken was once whole, he'd said more than once. Your job is to figure out what it looked like before and work backward. Mara stood up, rolled the blanket, shouldered the bag. Then she walked back down the mountain to Red Willow Crossing. The land office opened at 8. She was waiting on the step when the clerk arrived, a thin, mousy man named Aldrich, who looked at Mara with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that large women appearing on their doorstep before business hours rarely bring simple transactions. She set the deed on his counter and $15 in cash beside it. I want to register this as mine, she said. Full transfer. Whatever the fee is, it's in that pile. Aldrich looked at the deed, looked at the money, looked at Mara. His expression moved through several phases: confusion, mild concern, something approaching pity before landing, finally, on the professional blankness of a man doing his job. This is the Rourke claim, he said. I know what it is. Miss, that property has been sitting unclaimed for 6 years. The structure on it is it's not habitable. I'm not sure you understand what you're... The fee, she said. How much? A pause. Aldrich looked at the money again, looked at the deed. $11.40, he said. Mara counted out exactly $11 and 2 20-cent pieces. She took the change, her remaining $2, and put it in her pocket. Aldrich stamped the deed, wrote in the transfer date, initialed the corner, and slid it back across the counter. Congratulations, he said, in the tone of a man who does not mean it. Thank you, Mara said in the tone of a woman who does not care. She walked out into the morning and stood on the wooden sidewalk with the registered deed in her hand and $2 to her name and the canvas bag on her back and Gideon's fossil stone in her pocket. Behind her, she could hear Aldrich already talking to another clerk, who'd arrived late, explaining, in low tones that weren't quite low enough, what had just happened. The words heavy girl drifted through the open door, then the Rourke property, and then a sound that was unmistakably suppressed laughter. Mara did not go back inside. She walked to Etta Bellamy's boarding house instead, knocked on the back door, and asked if there was work she could do in exchange for a meal. Etta Bellamy was 61 years old and had the face of a woman who had heard every hard luck story in the territory and could tell the genuine ones from the performance ones in about 4 seconds. She looked Mara up and down, not the way Lenora looked, not assessing for inadequacy, but the way a builder looks at load-bearing potential, and said, "There's a cord of wood in the back that needs splitting before supper. Axe is in the shed." Mara split a cord of wood in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Etta fed her chicken soup and 3 biscuits and a slice of dried apple pie and asked 0 questions, which was either exceptional discretion or exceptional instinct. Probably both. I own the Rourke claim now, Mara said when the pie was mostly gone. Not explaining, not asking for anything, just stating a fact. Etta set down her coffee cup. Aldrich told you the building's not livable. He told me, Mara agreed. He's not wrong. He's not entirely right either. Mara pulled the deed from her jacket and smoothed it on the table. The walls are standing, the foundation's sound. The hearth looks intact. The roof's the problem and some debris clearance. But the bones are good. Etta looked at the deed for a moment, then at Mara. Who taught you to read a building like that? My grandfather. Gideon Whitlock. Something moved in Etta's expression. Gideon Whitlock, she repeated slowly, the way people repeat a name they recognize. Stone Gideon. He did the foundations on half the buildings on Main Street 20 years ago. The courthouse retaining wall. The bridge footings on Meridian Road. Yes, ma'am. Etta sat back and folded her hands on the table and looked at Mara for a long moment with an expression that had finally cleanly resolved itself into something that was not pity and was not discomfort and was not careful blankness. It was interest. You going back up tonight? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Mara said. I need to plan the work first. What to clear, what order to work, what I'll need from town before I can start the real repairs. Etta nodded slowly, picked up her coffee cup, set it down again. There's a room upstairs, she said. Small one. It's got a cot and a window. You can have it for tonight in exchange for the wood, and I won't charge you for the soup. Mara looked at her. Why? She asked. Because she had learned recently and conclusively that people did not offer things without reasons. Etta seemed to consider this question more seriously than most people would have. Because Stone Gideon built my front steps, she finally said, and they've been level for 22 years. That's a man who taught somebody right. She stood up and started clearing the dishes. Room's the second door on the left. Mara sat at the table alone for a moment after Etta left. $2 in her pocket, a deed to a broken mountain, a bag of old tools, and one meal that wasn't charity because she'd earned it with wood she'd split with her own hands. She thought about Lenora's face across the pot roast, about Raymond's careful eyes, about Gideon's voice, which she could hear as clearly as if he were sitting across from her right now, patient and dry, and entirely unimpressed with drama. Everything broken was once whole. Your job is to figure out what it looked like before and work backward. She picked up the deed, folded it carefully, put it back in her jacket pocket next to the fossil stone. Then she went upstairs and slept 8 solid hours, for the first time in months, while somewhere below her Etta Bellamy washed dishes and made no sound at all, the way people make no sound when they're being deliberately quiet so someone else can rest. In the morning, before Mara climbed back up to the ridge, she sat in Etta's kitchen and drew the dugout from memory every wall length she'd paced, every roofline angle she'd measured with her eyes, every weak joint she'd felt with her fingers. She listed what she'd need, what order to acquire it, what she could improvise from the ridge itself, and what she'd absolutely have to purchase. Her 2 remaining dollars were not enough. Not nearly. But the coins in the hidden box, she hadn't yet found the letter, she hadn't yet read Duditz, she hadn't yet uncovered, behind the cold stone of Amos Rourke's extraordinary hearth, none of that existed yet. She didn't know about any of it. She only knew the walls were standing, the foundation was sound, the hearth looked intact, and Gideon had taught her how to read what was broken and work backward toward what had once been whole. She shouldered the canvas bag and walked north toward the ridge. Behind her, the kitchen lights of Red Willow Crossing blinked on one by one, and the town woke up. And Aldrich told someone else about the heavy girl who'd wasted $15 on a worthless mountain. And the story spread through the morning, the way those stories always do, a little faster than truth, a little slower than understanding. Nobody watched her go. Nobody thought to. And that, as it would turn out, was the last mistake they'd make about Mara Whitlock for a very long time. She found it on the 3rd day. Not because she was looking for it, she wasn't. Not exactly. She was working on the hearth because the hearth was the logical place to begin. The structural anchor of the entire dugout, the thing that everything else would eventually depend on. Clear the hearth, establish the heat source, establish survivability. That was the sequence Gideon would have followed, and it was the sequence Mara followed now, because when your inheritance is a set of principles rather than property, you hold on to those principles the way other people hold on to money. The first 2 days had been about clearing. The debris inside the dugout was worse than it had looked from outside, which was saying something, because from outside it had looked genuinely catastrophic. The roof collapse had brought down not just the overhead timber, but a section of the north wall's upper course, which had in turn brought down whatever had been stored on shelves along that wall, rotted wooden crates, rusted iron implements she couldn't identify, and several hundred pounds of packed dirt and pine duff that had been accumulating since the last person walked out of this place and didn't come back. Mara worked the way Gideon had taught her to work in confined, unstable spaces, slowly with attention. You didn't grab and pull in a compromised structure. You assessed first. You identified what was holding what, and you removed things in reverse order of their structural contribution, lightest and most independent first, working toward the load-bearing pieces only after you understood exactly what they were bearing. She used a branch she'd cut to length as a lever. She used stones as fulcrums. She moved debris in quantities her body could actually manage, rather than quantities that impressed no one and herniated something. It took longer this way. It took the entire first day just to clear enough space inside the doorway to stand upright, and most of the second day to uncover the floor-packed earth, solid enough with the remains of what had once been a plank floor rotted to the point of powder in the corners. She slept on the boulder outside both nights, wrapped in the wool blanket, because she was not yet confident enough in the roof structure to sleep inside. The partial collapse had left a section of the original timber framework in place, 3 roof beams still seated in their wall notches, still carrying what remained of the roofing material, but she hadn't tested them yet. She hadn't put her weight underneath them, and until she did, she treated that space the way Gideon had taught her to treat any untested structure, with absolute respect. The hearth was the first truly solid thing she found. It was enormous, built for a hard mountain winter by someone who had understood, in their bones, what cold at altitude actually meant. The firebox was 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, built from slate and field granite, laid in courses that were still tight and true after what she estimated to be at least 30 years of abandonment. The lintel stone, a single piece of dressed granite nearly 5 feet long, was seated without a crack that she could see. The fireback was darkened from decades of use, but structurally sound. She spent 3 hours cleaning the firebox, scraping out accumulated debris with her pry bar, clearing the flue of the worst of the blockage. There was a collapsed bird's nest up in the throat that had to come out in pieces, and examining every joint in the firebox, surround with her fingers and her pocket light, a small oil lamp she'd brought from Etta's and promised to return. That was when she noticed the slate block. It was in the left breast of the chimney, at roughly hip height, 3rd course up from the hearth floor, 4th stone from the firebox face. It looked at first glance exactly like every other piece of slate in the surround, same color, same rough texture, same general dimensions. But it was fitted differently. Every other stone in the chimney had been set with mortar and seated permanently, the joints packed and pointed. This one had mortar around its edges, but the mortar was a different color, slightly lighter, slightly newer looking, applied carefully to simulate a permanent joint rather than actually create one. Mara ran her thumbnail along the edge of the stone. The mortar crumbled, dried out to the point of powder, no longer adhering to anything. She could have picked it loose with her fingers. She stared at the stone for a moment. Then she picked up her hammer and tapped it once, lightly in the center. The sound it made was not the sound a solid, mortar-bedded stone makes. It was hollow. Not dramatically hollow, not a resonant boom, not the obvious clunk of someone tapping an empty box. Just a fractional difference in the quality of the sound, the way a full vessel and an empty one sound different when you knock them, a distinction most people wouldn't catch and wouldn't care about, even if they did. Mara caught it. She set down the hammer. She took the pry bar. She worked the flat end into the joint. At the bottom of the stone, there was just enough gap, once the false mortar was brushed away, and applied gentle, even pressure, and the stone came forward. It was heavy, 12, maybe 15 pounds of dressed slate. She caught it with both hands before it could drop, and set it carefully on the hearth floor, and looked into the space behind it. The cavity was roughly the size of a large shoebox. The walls were the raw interior of the chimney structure, unfinished, dusty, slightly damp from years of absorbed moisture. And sitting in the center of that cavity, wrapped a piece of oilskin cloth that had cracked and darkened with age, but had done its job, was a metal box. Mara did not immediately reach for it. She looked at it for what was probably 30 seconds, though it felt longer. The way time always expands around things you suspect are going to change something. The box was iron, hand-forged, roughly 9 inches long, and 4 inches wide and 3 inches deep, with a simple clasp and no lock. The oilskins around it was tied with a cord that had gone stiff and brittle, and when she touched it, the cord broke in 2 places. She lifted the box out of the cavity. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the doorway, where the light was better, and sat down on the threshold with the box in her lap, and the canvas bag behind her, and the ridge wind moving through the spruce trees at the edge of the clearing. She opened the clasp. Inside the box there were 4 things. There were coins, gold and silver, a mix of denominations, stacked in careful columns that had shifted slightly with time, but were still recognizable as deliberate arrangement. She didn't count them yet. She could see at a glance there were more of them than she'd had in her entire life. There was a small wooden bird, carved by hand, not painted. The grain of the wood, still visible through what had once been a coat of linseed oil, now dried to a faint sheen. A sparrow, she thought, or something close to it. The carver hadn't been aiming for ornithological precision, had been aiming for something else, something in the posture of the bird, the way its head was turned slightly, as though listening. And there was a letter, 2 pages, folded in quarters, written in a hand that was educated but not elegant, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write as a practical skill rather than an art, and who had written this particular letter with some efforts, slowly, the pen pressure varying in ways that suggested he'd stopped more than once. She unfolded it. To whoever finds this place, my name is Amos Rourke. I built this shelter in the year my wife Clara and I came to Blackthorn Ridge with our daughter Nell, who was then 4 years old. We came looking for silver and found enough of it to live on, and not much more, which is the story of most people who come to mountains looking for what the mountains are not obligated to give. Clara died in the fever summer when Nell was 6. Nell died 11 days after her mother. Hours of its windows were dark. I was away from the camp both times, which is something I will not write more about because I have already written about it too many times in the years since, and it has not helped. After that, I stayed on the ridge for 3 more years because I did not know where else to go and because leaving felt like a second abandonment. I worked the mine when I could make myself work. I improved the shelter because it gave me something to do with my hands. I built the hearth, larger than we'd originally planned, because Clara had always wanted a proper hearth, and I wanted to give her something even if she was no longer there to use it. The coins in this box are 31 years of what I earned and saved and did not spend, because there was nothing I wanted to spend it on after they were gone. I am old now and I am going down to the valley and I am not coming back, not because I am giving up on this place, but because I can no longer manage the winters alone and I am done pretending otherwise. I am leaving the box here because I do not want to bring it with me. Money in a pocket has a way of making people treat you as though you have something worth taking. I would rather leave it somewhere it might do genuine good. If you found this, you came up to this ridge for a reason. People do not come up here by accident. Whatever your reason was, I hope this helps. The bird belonged to Nell. She called it Pip. I would ask that you keep it safe, not because it is worth anything, but because it was hers, and I cannot take it with me either. The shelter is yours if you want it. I built it to last. It deserves someone in it. Amos Rourke Mara read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully, set the box and set back in the box and set the box on the hearth floor and sat down on stone beside it with her back against the chimney breast and her knees drawn up and her face in her hands. She did not cry immediately. There was a delay, the way there's always a delay when something hits you in a place that's been braced. For so long, the bracing itself has become structural, and you need a moment for the bracing to recognize that the impact was not an attack, but something else entirely. Then she cried, not prettily, not the kind of crying that looks like something in a painting, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below the chest, that shakes the shoulders and blurs the vision and makes sounds you'd be embarrassed about if anyone were there to hear them. The kind that comes out when you've been holding something so long that releasing it is almost violent. She cried for Amos Rourke, who had stayed on a mountain for 3 years in the company of a hearth he'd built for a woman who would never use it. She cried for Clara and Nell Rourke, who had died 11 days apart and been buried somewhere on this ridge by a man too wrecked to leave. She cried for Gideon, whose tools were in the bag beside her, and whose voice she could still hear, and who had been the only person in her life who had looked at her exactly as she was and found her not just acceptable but genuinely good. She cried for her mother, whose face she could still see clearly when she tried, and sometimes couldn't see at all. She cried for Raymond's careful eyes across the pot roast, which was somehow the worst of all of it not hatred. Just the particular and devastating species of disappointment that only comes from someone who was supposed to love you. She cried for a while, then she stopped, because she had always been good at stopping, and she wiped her face on her sleeve, and she sat there in the ruined doorway of Amos Rourke's abandoned shelter with the iron box on the hearth floor and the wooden sparrow sitting in the lid and a dead man's savings stacked in neat columns, and she thought about what to do. Taking the money and walking away was obviously possible. She could count those coins, put them in her pocket, walk down to Red Willow Crossing, and purchase a train ticket to somewhere she'd never been and start over with more resources than she'd had 3 days ago. Amos himself had said it. I hope this helps. He hadn't specified how. She sat with that option for a while, the way you sit, with options when you're honest with yourself about them. Then she picked up the wooden sparrow and turned it over in her hands. The carving was careful. Even where it was imprecise, you could see where the knife had slipped once in the tail featherston, and the carver had worked with the slip rather than trying to correct it, adapting the shape to the accident. Someone who knew they weren't a master carver but was doing it with love rather than technique. Nell was 6 when she died. Mara held the bird. She was not a sentimental woman by nature. She had been raised in a family that treated sentiment as either self-indulgence or performance, and she'd developed a certain guardedness around it as a result. But there was something about holding a thing that a 6-year-old had held a thing carved for a child who'd called it Pip and presumably dragged it around this shelter and probably slept with it that bypassed all the guardedness entirely. She wasn't walking away. She knew that before she finished the thought. She'd known it probably from the moment she'd unfolded Amos's letter, but she'd let herself sit with the alternative long enough to confirm it wasn't cowardice keeping her. It was choice. She was going to honor what Amos had asked for. She was going to rebuild the shelter. Not because it was the practical decision it wasn't, particularly. Not because she had nowhere else to go she did, now at least in theory, but because Gideon had taught her, more by example than by instruction, that the right response to being given something unearned was to earn it backward, to do something with it that justified the giving. And Amos Rourke had left his entire life's savings and his daughter's carved bird in a hollow in a chimney he'd built with his own hands, and what he'd asked for was simple: someone in it. She was someone, she would be in it. The counting took 20 minutes. She organized the coins by denomination on the flat hearthstone, working methodically, recording each column's total in the dirt with her finger before moving on. When she was finished, she sat back and looked at the number in the dirt for a long time. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. More than Raymond had ever made in a year. More than enough to buy everything she'd need and have a substantial amount left over, and kept carefully, not spent frivolously, used only when the work actually required it, because this was Amos Rourke's 31 years, and she was going to treat it accordingly. She repacked the coins carefully in the box, put the letter on top of them, put the wooden sparrow on top of the letter, closed the clasp. Then she looked at the chimney cavity. She measured it with her hand, pacing the depth, assessing the dimensions. The box fit back in, with room to spare. She thought about this. She'd need the money soon, needed to get into town for supplies, but something stopped her from leaving the box, sitting out in the open. She slid it back into the cavity, not because she was hiding it, but because it felt wrong to leave it exposed. It had been protected for decades. She wasn't going to start carelessly now. She tapped the slate block back into place. Then she sat in the doorway with Amos's letter open in her lap one more time, reading the last paragraph again. The shelter is yours if you want it. I built it to last. It deserves someone in it. She looked up at the ridge, at the standing walls, solid even after all this neglect, at the enormous lintel stone seated without a crack, at the hearth, which was the best single piece of masonry she'd ever examined with her own hands. Amos Rourke had been a better stonemason than a silver miner. She could work with that. 3 days later, Mara came down off Blackthorn Ridge and walked into Red Willow Crossing with Gideon's canvas bag over one shoulder and an iron box under her arm and an expression on her face that made Aldrich, who happened to be crossing the street at the same moment, step slightly out of her path, without quite knowing why. She went to Harlan's Hardware first. Harlan Pressey was a thick-shouldered man in his mid-50s who had run the hardware supply on Main Street for 20 years and who had a talent for looking at people who came through his door and estimating, within about 90 seconds, whether they were worth his time. He was not a cruel man. He was simply efficient, and efficiency in retail, he had found, meant reading customers fast. He read Mara Whitlock fast. What he read initially was what most people read: a young woman, heavyset, work-worn, carrying a bag that clanked with old tools and an iron box that she set on his counter without ceremony. What he estimated was small purchase, probably maybe replacement handles, maybe a few nails. What he got was a written list. She slid it across the counter. He picked it up, read it, set it down, picked it up again. The list was 3 pages long, written in a precise hand, organized by category. Lumber specifications with exact board feet and dimensions. Iron hardware itemized by type and quantity. Rope 3 separate weights. Specific breaking strength noted. Lime for mortar, sand. 2 specific grades of gravel. Oakum for joint sealing. Various consumables: linseed oil, turpentine, tallow, wax. A detailed breakdown of the roofing materials, including the number and weight of the cedar shingles, the ridge pieces, the hip pieces, and the estimated waste factor she'd already calculated at 12% and noted explicitly. Harlan looked up from the list. Mara was watching him, read with an expression of complete patience. "This is for the Rourke claim," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You're rebuilding the roof and repointing the walls. The hearth sound, but the flue needs lining above the throat. I'll need fire clay for that. I didn't put it on the list. Add it." Harlan set the list down carefully. "Who drew these specifications up?" "I did." He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but with the particular attention of a man recalibrating his estimate. "You designed this lift system yourself?" The section of the list dealing with the ridge beam installation, she'd included a brief mechanical description of the ramp and rope system she planned to use, both so he could understand the rope weight requirements and so she could get a second set of eyes on the load calculation. "Yes. The beam's the hard part. I've got the angles and the anchor points worked out, but I need to confirm the rope rating before I commit to a purchase. If your breaking strength figures differ from my calculation, I want to know before I'm halfway up a ramp with a timber that weighs 400 pounds. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you to think like this?" he asked. "Gideon Whitlock." He blinked. "Stone Gideon Whitlock. My grandfather." There was a shift in the room, small and visible, but Mara felt it the way she felt the fractures in stone. Something had changed in how Harlan Pressey was looking at her, and it wasn't the sentimental recognition that Etta had shown, the warm flash of "I knew him." It was something more transactional, and therefore in some ways more useful. It was professional recalibration. Gideon Whitlock's name in this territory was not just a memory. It was a reference. "I'll need the rope rating verified," Mara said again. "I'll verify it," Harlan said. He picked up the list again and reached for a pencil. "Some of this lumber I can have ready in 2 days. The cedar shingles I'll need to order from the mill. That's a week, maybe 10 days. The fire clay I've got in back." He was already moving down the list, making marks. "You've got a transport plan? I'm going to talk to Calder Voss." Harlan looked up. "Voss is particular about his routes." "I know. I've got a proposal for him." There was a pause. Harlan studied her face for a moment, and then he did something she didn't expect. He almost smiled. Not quite, because Harlan Pressey's face was not architecturally suited to easy smiling, but something in it loosened. "I'll have an itemized total for you by end of day," he said. "Come back at 4. Calder Voss was not easy to find and not easy to talk to once found. He was a man of perhaps 50, who had spent 30 of those years driving freight through mountain terrain and had the particular self-containment of someone who has spent a significant portion of his life alone in difficult places. He was not unfriendly. He was simply precise. He said what he meant, expected you to say what you meant, and had very little patience for people who used 10 words when 3 would do. Mara found him at the livery, checking the shoes on his lead mule with the concentration of a surgeon. She stood a few feet away and waited until he looked up. "Voss," she said, "I need freight hauled to Blackthorn Ridge. I've got lumber coming from Harlan's in 2 days and a second load in 10. I'll pay you the standard mountain rate plus 20% for the grade." Calder straightened up and looked at her with pale, direct eyes. "Rourke claim," he said. "Yes. People haul supplies up that trail, and they don't come back to tell me it was worth it. I'm not asking you to haul it for free. I'm asking you to haul it for money. A pause. He wiped his hands on a rag. What's the weight on the first load? She told him. He did the math in his head, which she could see him doing, his eyes focused slightly past her left ear while he ran the calculations. Then he named a number. It was 20% higher than the standard rate, plus 20%. She didn't blink. Agreed. He looked at her differently than the way Harlan had looked at her differently. That specific recalibration, except where Harlan's had been about professional recognition. Calder's was something more instinctive. The look of a man who has learned to read people in terms of reliability rather than affability, and who has just updated his file. 2 days, he said. Sunrise, you'll be at the trailhead. I'll be there. She was there at first light with the hardware she'd already purchased on her back. And Calder arrived 20 minutes later with 2 mules loaded with the first lumber delivery and a look on his face that suggested he'd half expected she wouldn't show. He watched her load her portion of the hardware without saying anything. The trail up to Blackthorn Ridge was steep enough that the mules set their own pace and there was no point in trying to hurry them. Mara climbed alongside the second animal, helping to steady the load on the switchbacks, her hand on the rope tie, her feet finding purchase on the trail with the careful deliberateness she'd developed over the 2 previous ascents. Her body's relationship with the grade hadn't improved. It was still punishing, still demanded more of her than it demanded of lighter people, but she'd learned the trail now. She knew where to place her weight. She knew which sections required short steps and which she could stride through. She knew to breathe before the steep parts and not try to breathe through them. Calder watched this without comment. They reached the claim in the mid-morning. Calder walked the perimeter of the dugout while Mara unloaded the lumber. He was quiet the whole time, looking at the walls with his hands in his jacket pockets, the way a man looks at something he's reassessing. The walls are better than I expected, he said finally. I know, Mara said, without looking up from the lumber stack. Who built this originally? Amos Rourke. Calder was quiet for a moment. Heard of him. Didn't know he was a mason. He wasn't. He was a miner. But he built well when he built. She straightened up and looked at the walls. Miners build to last, because they know what it costs to rebuild when you're that far from town. He thought it through. Calder turned and looked at her. You're 18, he said. Not unkindly. Just stating it, the way he stated things. As a fact requiring acknowledgement. Yes. You bought this claim for yourself. $15. And you're going to rebuild the roof alone. Not alone, she said. That's why I hired you. Something worked in his face that might have been amusement if it had been allowed to develop fully. It didn't quite get there. I haul freight, he said. I don't do construction. I'm not asking you to do construction. I need you for the beam raise. That's a 2-person operation, and the second person needs to be capable. She pulled the mechanical sketch from her jacket. She'd drawn it on paper from Etta's kitchen, the ramp geometry and rope, routing and anchor points she'd worked out over 3 nights. I've got the system designed. I need someone on the mule team when we redirect the load at the top of the ramp. The mules know you. They won't respond to me the same way. Calder took the sketch. He studied it for a long time. Long enough that she started to think he was going to object, or hand it back and say it was above his pay grade, or simply decline and leave her to figure out another approach. He didn't hand it back. The anchor here, he said, pointing to a spot on the sketch. You've got it tied to that spruce? The big one, 20 feet east of the doorway. It's rooted deep, I tested it. If the load shifts left on the ramp, that anchor point creates a pendulum effect. You want a secondary anchor at 45 degrees to kill the swing. She looked at where he was pointing. He was right. She hadn't seen it, and it was the kind of thing that wouldn't matter 99 times out of 100, and would matter catastrophically on the 100th. Secondary anchor, she said. Agreed. I'll rig it before we lift. He folded the sketch and handed it back. Day after the second lumber load, he said, I'll stay for the beam raise. She nodded. He stayed that night, which she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. He'd simply not volunteered to leave, and she hadn't asked him to go. He made a fire outside and ate from his own provisions, and sat across from it with the particular stillness of a man comfortable with silence. And Mara sat on her side of the fire with Amos's letter in her jacket pocket and the wooden sparrow in her hand, turning it over slowly, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Calder said, How long do you figure for the walls? She looked up. Repointing? 3 weeks if the weather holds. I'll do it in sections, working from the base up. Roof after that. Roof before winter. The repointing can finish after I've got a sealed structure. He nodded. Poked the fire once. What happened to your family, he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She thought about what to say, how much to say, whether it was any of his business. Then she thought that a man who'd agreed to stay and help raise a beam without being asked had probably earned a straight answer. My mother died when I was 15. My grandfather 2 years later. My father and his wife sold the family house and gave me $17 and the deed to this place and told me to be gone before sunrise. Calder looked at the fire. $17, he said. I spent 15 of it on the claim. Another silence. That was your father, he said. Not quite a question. Yes. And you didn't. Started again. You didn't go back. There was nowhere to go back to. He was quiet for a while after that. The fire burned down and the ridge wind came up, and somewhere in the spruce trees, something moved a branch, falling, probably, or an animal, and Mara pulled the blanket tighter and watched the coals and listened to the mountains settle around her. My wife died 11 years ago, Calder said, very quietly, into the fire. I was on the freight road when it happened. I've been driving routes since. It's because routes have a start and a finish, and that's easier than places that are just places. He stopped. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to complete the thought or smooth it over or offer something in return. She just let it sit there, the way he'd let her words sit, because sometimes the right response to someone saying something true is simply to let it be true. The fire went out eventually, and they both slept Calder in his bedroll, Mara on her boulder, and in the morning he was up before her, already tending the mules, and they didn't mention the conversation again. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way either of them would have named. Just the quality of the silence between them changed. It stopped being the silence between strangers and became the silence between people who have said one difficult true thing to each other and don't need to say it again to remember that it happened. The second lumber delivery came 8 days later, the cedar shingles slightly ahead of schedule because the mill had a cancellation. Calder brought them up in 2 trips, one morning and one afternoon, and Mara helped unload both times and stack the shingles in the order she'd need them, protected under canvas weighted with stones. The day after the second delivery, they raised the ridge beam. Mara had spent 4 days preparing the ramp. Packed earth tamped hard, angled at a grade, the timber would slide rather than tumble, the surface course covered with stripped pine bark to reduce friction. She'd set the secondary anchor Calder had identified, a large wedge of quartz-veined granite she'd moved with the lever system, and run a secondary rope from the anchor through a pulley she'd hung from the standing roof beam to redirect tension without changing the mule team's direction of pull. She'd built notches in the top of each wall where the beam would seat. She'd cut them herself with Gideon chisels, working for 2 days, measuring 4 times before she cut, because a notch cut wrong in stone was a notch cut wrong forever, and she was not cutting anything twice. The beam was a lodgepole pine she and Calder had felled together 3 days earlier, 40 feet long, roughly 12 inches across at the butt end, and heavy enough that neither of them could budge it alone. They'd limbed it together, debarked it, and moved it to the base of the ramp, using a combination of roller sections of smaller timber laid crosswise and the lever system. The morning they raised it, Calder rigged the mule team in silence. Mara set the rope configuration and tested every connection point twice. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say. Either the system worked or it didn't, and they'd know within the first few minutes. They began the lift. The mule team pulled. The rope went taut. The beam moved. It moved slowly, agonizingly slowly up the earthen ramp, the pine bark beneath it compressing and releasing, compressing and releasing. Mara watched the rope angles, watched the anchor points, watched the beam's trajectory against the notch targets she'd marked on the wall top with white chalk. 40 feet up the ramp. 60. The rope slipped. Not catastrophically, not a full failure, not a snap. But the secondary rope jumped its pulley under the load shift, and the beam swung 6 inches to the left. And for one terrible moment, 380 pounds of lodgepole pine was pivoting at the top of a ramp with nothing but gravity deciding where it was going next. Mara drove the locking wedge she'd had staged beside her into the support notch on the ramp before she'd finished processing what she was doing, muscle memory or something below muscle memory, some reflex Gideon had installed in her over years of watching him work. The understanding that in structural emergencies, the first action is always stop the movement. Understand later. The wedge caught. The beam stopped. Calder had already redirected. The mule team left. She hadn't told him to. He'd read the swing and reacted, and the secondary rope tension equalized, and the beam sat there, canted slightly but stable, held by the wedge and the redirected rope. They both stood still for a moment. The mountain wind moved through the spruce trees. "You," cried, Calder said. "Yes." She was checking the wedge. It had seated clean. "Pulley needs a repositioning before we continue. I'll reset it." It took 20 minutes to reposition the pulley, retighten the secondary rope, and verify all the anchor connections before she was willing to continue. She walked every point, tugged every junction, looked at the beam's position on the ramp, and calculated what the last 6 inches of raffle would look like before she authorized another inch of movement. Then she said, "Ready." They resumed the lift. The beam traveled the last 12 feet of the ramp in approximately 4 minutes, moving steadily and tracking perfectly, and when it reached the top of the ramp, Mara guided it manually with both hands and a rope guide she'd set for exactly this purpose, and it dropped into the carved notches with a sound that she felt in her sternum. A clean, solid, structural thunk, both notches, simultaneously, level. Calder stood at the base of the ramp and looked up at the beam seated in the wall. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he took his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at the beam and at the walls and at the notches and at Mara standing on the wall beside the seated timber with chalk's dust on her hands and sweat soaking through her jacket from collar to hip. "I'll be damned," he said quietly, not performing it, just meaning it. Mara looked at the beam. She looked at the notches, reached out and put one hand flat on the timber and felt the grain of it, the solidity of it. The fact that it was seated and level and would still be there in 20 years if she built around it correctly. Her hand was shaking. She noticed this with a kind of detached interest, the way you notice something about your own body when you've been too focused on something else to notice it in real time. "Let's roof it," she said. They started on the roof the following morning. Calder had stayed again, not because Mara asked, and not because he announced he was staying, but because when evening came, he'd simply made his fire on the same side as the night before and pulled out his provisions and sat down, and Mara had accepted this the way she was learning to accept certain things from Calder Voss, without comment, without ceremony, and with something that wasn't quite gratitude, but was adjacent to it. The cedar shingles had been stacked in order under canvas for 9 days. Marga had spent those 9 days building the secondary roof structure, the rafters that ran from the ridge beam down to the wall plates, each one notched to seat on the plate and pegged to the ridge, each notch cut by hand with Gideon's chisels and tested for fit before the rafter was lifted into position. She'd worked alone on those, which meant she'd had to develop a system for holding each rafter at angle while she checked the seat a prop and clamp arrangement using forked branches and rope loops that was ugly and slow, and worked perfectly. Gideon had always said that ugly solutions that worked were superior to elegant solutions that didn't, and she'd been proving it daily. By the time the ridge beam was in, she had 11 of the 14 rafters seated. The last 3 went up the morning after the beam raise, with Calder steadying the base of each one while she adjusted the seat and drove the peg. Then the sheathing boards. Then the shingles. The shingling was the part she'd been most nervous about. Not because the technique was complicated, it wasn't. Gideon had taught her to shingle before she was 12, but because it required working at height on a surface that was at 30 degrees and would be unforgiving if she slipped. Her body's center of gravity was different from a lighter person's, and the physics of recovering from a slip were different too. She'd thought about this for weeks. She'd arrived at the ridge each morning, and looked at the roofline and run the scenario in her head, which was what you did when the scenario was dangerous, and you couldn't afford to discover the problem in real time. Her solution was to work lower than felt natural, to keep 3 points of contact whenever she was moving across the slope, and to use a rope sling she'd rigged from the ridge beam, looped around her waist, long enough to allow working movement, but short enough to arrest a slide before she went over the eave. It was uncomfortable. It slowed her down. She didn't care. She would rather be slow and on the roof than fast and on the ground. Calder watched her rig the sling without commenting on it. He handed shingles up from below, a stack at a time, and kept track of the spacing marks she'd chalked on the sheathing, and called out if something looked off from the ground, a slight warp in a board, a shingle that had seated at a fractional angle, things that were easier to see from below than from directly above. He had an eye for level, which she'd noticed when he was working with the mule team, and it turned out the eye transferred to roof work, even though he'd never claimed any skill at it. They didn't talk much while they worked. This was fine with both of them. What Mara noticed over the first 3 days of shingling was that the silence had changed quality again, not in the way it had after the fire conversation, but in the way it changes between people who were doing hard physical work together and have learned each other's timing. She could tell when Calder was about to pass a shingle up before he moved to get it. He could tell when she was ready for the next course before she called for it. The work developed a rhythm that wasn't discussed or arranged, that simply emerged from two people paying attention. On the 4th day of shingling, it rained. Not a gentle rain. A serious, sustained, 3-inch in 6 hours mountain rain that came in from the northwest without much warning and turned the exposed sheathing boards dark and slick and made the unfinished sections of roof about as safe to work on as a greased skillet. Most of its windows were dark. Mara came off the roof in under 4 minutes when the first heavy drops hit, systematic, not panicked, unclipping the sling and descending the ladder in the deliberate manner of someone who had considered this scenario in advance. They sheltered. In the partially roofed section of the dugout, the eastern 2/3 of the roof was now shingled and sealed, which meant there was real interior shelter for the first time since she'd arrived. They sat inside with the rain hammering the new cedar above them and the old stone walls cutting the wind, and the partial shelter was revelatory in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd built this, not finished yet, not tight yet, but genuinely and structurally above her head, keeping weather off. Calder sat across from her, with his back against the north wall and his knees up and his eyes on the unfinished section where the rain came through the gap between the completed shingles and the exposed sheathing. Gaps maybe 8 feet, he said. 7.5. 2 more courses on each side plus the ridge cap. She'd been calculating it in her head since they came down. If this clears by tomorrow morning, I can finish in a day. And if it doesn't clear, then I work the mortar in the meantime. The repointing in the protected sections can continue regardless of rain. He nodded. The rain was loud. It drummed the new cedar in a way that was almost rhythmic, almost pleasant from the inside, which she found unexpectedly moving the sound of weather on a thing you built. The way it separated the inside from the outside, which was the fundamental trips of any structure, and the thing that was easy to take for granted until you'd spent 3 weeks without it. "You're not what I expected," Calder said. She looked at him. "When Aldrich told me about the heavy girl who bought the Rourke claim," he said, without particular emphasis on any part of the description, "I assumed I'd be hauling freight up here once, and that would be the end of it. What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just thinking, the way he always thought before he said something, which she'd come to recognize as a sign that what came next would be actual. "The list," he said. "The one you showed Harlan. I saw it when he was reviewing the lumber order. The waste factor calculations, the load specifications. Most people who come up here to try something on a mountain don't think about waste factors." He looked at the completed roofing above them. "They think about the dream and not the math." "You thought about the math." Mara looked at the rain coming through the gap. "The math is the dream," she said. "If you can't calculate it, you can't build it." Calder made a sound that was halfway between agreement and amusement. The rain cleared by mid-afternoon the following day. Mara was back on the roof by 3 o'clock and finished the last 2 cours on the west side by nightfall, working by the light of the oil lamp propped on the ridge so she could see the spacing marks. She would have done the ridge cap that night, too, but the new mortar she needed for the ridge ceiling had to be mixed fresh, and it was too dark to work the stone correctly. And she was not going to rush the ridge cap, because the ridge cap was the thing that determined whether every drop of rain for the next 30 years went into the structure or off it. She did the ridge cap the following morning. Calder held the first stone while she mixed and applied the mortar, the mix she'd gotten from Gideon, by watching him make it dozens of times. Limes and sand, in the proportion that cured flexible enough to handle freeze-thaw cycling without cracking, which was non-negotiable at elevation. She worked the ridge cap in 3 sections, each section given time to firm before she moved to the next, and when the last piece was seated and pointed, she came down the ladder and stood in the clearing and looked up. The roof was done. She stood there for approximately 30 seconds looking at it, and the feeling was not triumphant in any dramatic sense. It was quieter than that, more like the feeling of a long breath finally released. She had looked at this roofline for 7 weeks as a problem, as something broken, something absent, something requiring a solution. Now it was solved. Now it above the walls where it belonged, doing what a roof does, and in 30 years it would still be there if someone maintained it, and the structure underneath it would survive whatever weather the mountain chose to deliver. "It's square," Calder said from beside her. "It should be," she said. "I cut the notches square." "I know. I'm saying it looks it from here. Sometimes things are square in calculation, and a little off in execution. Yours isn't." She said nothing to that, but she heard it. Calder left 2 days later with his mules and his empty freight frames and the particular unhurried efficiency of a man who departs the same way he arrives, without theater. He'd said what he had to say and done what he'd agreed to do, and a little more besides, and he was going back to his roots now, which had a start and a finish. At the trailhead he stopped and turned back. "There's a widow on Meridian Road," he said. "Etta Bellamy. I think you know her, I know her. She's going to come up here." Mara looked at him. "Did you tell her to?" "I told her what you'd done with the roof. She made her own decisions." He settled the lead mule's rope in his hand. "She makes most of her own decisions." Then he went down the trail, and Mara went back up to the ridge, and she didn't see him again for 3 weeks. The repointing work began in earnest. It was in some ways the most exacting work she'd done yet. The roof had been complex in its engineering and dramatic in its execution. The beam raised which had the quality of an event, something you could tell as a story with a before and an after. The repointing was neither complex nor dramatic. It was patient, precise, repetitive work that demanded attention every single minute without providing any of the rewards that kept attention fed. You scraped old mortar from the joint, cleaned the void, mixed fresh mortar in the correct proportion, packed it, tooled it, moved 6 inches, scraped, cleaned, packed, tooled, over and over, course by course, section by section, in every weather that didn't freeze the mortar before it could cure. Her hands blistered in the first week. Not from the scraping from the lime, which was caustic in skin if you weren't careful about washing up. She'd known this going in and had gloves, but the gloves reduced feel, and she needed feel to pack the joints correctly. And so she wore the gloves for the scraping and took them off for the packing and paid the price in her palms, which cracked and wept in the cold nights and were stiff every morning until she'd worked them warm. Gideon had had hands like this. She'd held them as a child and felt the ridges and calluses without understanding what they signified. She understood now. She worked 6 days a week. Sundays she rested not from principle, but because her body had found its limit and insisted on it, she'd push through, and her hands would stop cooperating, her concentration would go patchy. She'd make small errors in mortar consistency that would cost her the next morning. Better to stop and be right than to push and have to redo it. On her 3rd Sunday of repointing rest, Etta came. Mara heard the sound on the trail before she saw anyone, not the sound of a single person climbing, but the sound of a laden pack, something shifting and rattling. And when she came around the north wall to look, she saw Etta Bellamy about 40 feet below the summit, moving up the last steep section with a large canvas pack on her back and a look on her face that suggested she found the grade offensive but was not going to say so. Mara stood at the top of the trail and watched her arrive. Etta reached the flat of the summit clearing, set the pack down, put her hands on her knees for approximately 10 seconds, stood back up, and looked at the dugout. She looked at it for a long time. At the new roof, the repointed lower courses, the cleared doorway, the stacked lumber waiting to become the interior partition, the chimney with its new clay-lined upper section. She walked if its windows were dark. She walked the perimeter slowly, touching the stones the way Mara touched them, which was something you either did or didn't do and couldn't really teach. Calder said you fixed the roof, she said finally. He undersold it. He undersells most things. That's true. Etta turned and looked at the north wall. The repointing's good. You're packing to the face? Mara blinked slightly. Yes. You know pointing work? My husband built half the buildings in Red Willow Crossing before his heart gave out. I watched him do everything twice before I understood anything once. She prodded a joint with her thumbnail. This is solid. How much more? East wall and the partial interior. Maybe 10 days. Etta nodded. She went back to the pack and unstrapped it and began pulling things out. A cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be a whole loaf of bread, still warm from this morning's oven. Roasted chicken wrapped in paper. 2 jars of preserves blackberry. It looked like, and something orange-colored, maybe apricot. A wedge of hard cheese. A tin of ground coffee. And a pie, an actual full-sized pie in a cloth-covered tin that made Mara stare. You carried a pie up this trail, Mara said. I carried a pie up this trail, Etta agreed. That grade is almost 30 degrees in sections. I'm aware. Etta set the pie tin on the flat stone that served as Mara's outdoor work table. You want some or not? Mara sat down. They ate the chicken and the bread first without plates because there were no plates and Etta hadn't brought any. And the bread was so good it made Mara briefly unable to speak. She'd been eating from her provisions for weeks: dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, dried fruit food that fueled rather than pleased. The bread was warm and had a crackling crust and smelled like yeast and wood smoke, and it was one of those things that hits a different register entirely when you've been living on survival rations. Calder said your father threw you out, Etta said, pulling apart bread. Mara looked at her. He didn't use those words, Etta said. He used better words. But that was the meaning. That's close enough. And your mother was already gone. 3 years ago. Etta was quiet for a moment, pulling a piece of chicken off the bone. My husband died 14 years ago, she said. I had the boarding house and $40 and a lot of people who felt sorry for me, which is a specific kind of loneliness that people who haven't experienced it don't understand. She wiped her hands on the paper wrapper. The pity is well meant, but it's also slightly condescending. It assumes you can't manage. Mara looked at her. Is that why you didn't ask me any questions that first night? I asked you about the wood. You asked me about the building. Etta half smiled. Building and wood are adjacent. She broke off a piece of cheese. You didn't need pity. You needed a cot and a meal, and you'd already worked for both. So I gave them to you without the pity. Seemed more respectful. Mara looked at the completed roof above them. My father thought I needed protection, she said, not bitterly just stating it. His wife thought I needed to be different than I am. Both of them thought that my being, she paused, looking for the word, the size I am made me less capable, less useful, less worth keeping. And you came up a mountain with $17, Etta said, and rebuilt a structure that's been derelict for 30 years. $15, Mara said. I spent $2 on food. Etta looked at her steadily. Your grandfather taught you well. He taught me everything that matters. A pause. I still hear him. When I'm working out a problem, the voice is still there, telling me to check the load path, check the mortar consistency, don't cut the notch until you've measured it 4 times. Etta was quiet for a moment. Then, that's not nothing. Having that voice. No, Mara agreed. It's not nothing. They ate the pie. It was apple, not apricot. She'd been wrong about that. Apple with a crumble top and a bottom crust that was somehow both crisp and tender, which Mara didn't fully understand as a culinary achievement, but appreciated entirely as an experience. She ate 2 slices and would have eaten a third, but Etta divided the remaining piece between them, and she wasn't going to argue. After Etta left navigating the trail down with the empty pack and the same look of restrained offense at the grade, Mara went back to the interior. She'd been working on the interior partition for 2 weeks, alongside the repointing, a dry-stacked stone wall that divided the single large space of the dugout into 2 rooms, one that would be the main living area with the hearth, and most of its windows were dark, and one that would be a smaller sleeping area she'd planned to build against the east wall next spring. The partition was not structural, so she built it without mortar, which meant she built it faster, and also meant she could reconfigure it later if she needed to. She'd built the bed frame first. This felt backwards to people who thought in terms of aesthetic priorities, floors before furniture or walls before fixtures. But she'd been sleeping on the boulder for going on 8 weeks, and she was done with that. The frame was a simple pine, pegged not nailed, with a rope lattice across the base, and a mattress she'd purchased from Etta's boarding house and stuffed with dried grass and pine needles. It was not comfortable in any way she'd have described that to someone who had never slept on bare stone. Relative to bare stone, it was extraordinary. She built a table next, also pine, also pegged, with the top boards cut from the leftover sheathing lumber and planed flat with the hand plane she'd purchased in the second supply order. The plane had been more expensive than she'd wanted, but she'd needed it, and the table surface it produced was smooth enough to write on and work on and eat from without a cloth. The shelves along the west wall she built from rough-cut boards and wooden pegs driven into the mortar joints. She'd planned the peg holes when she was repointing, placing them at intervals that would take the boards. This was the kind of forward-thinking Gideon had drilled into her. When you're doing one thing, think about the three things that follow it and build for them now while you still have access, because access closes as construction progresses, and the things you didn't plan for become the most expensive mistakes. The shelves were empty when she built them. She stood back and looked at them for a while. When they were done, 8 feet of empty shelving on a ridge in a half-finished stone shelter with no insulation yet, and a floor that was still packed earth and felt. Something that she eventually identified as anticipation. Not satisfaction, which came from completion. Anticipation, which came from incompleteness that was nonetheless moving towards something. She was going to fill those shelves. The thought of it, flour and dried beans and preserved meat and medicines and tools and rope and seed for a kitchen garden was more motivating than she'd expected it to be. It was specific. It was measurable. It was exactly the kind of goal that Gideon would have recognized as productive, because it was attached to a plan rather than a feeling. She was still thinking about the shelves when she heard the voice. It came from the trail below the clearing, not Calder's voice, not Etta's, not anyone she recognized. 2 voices, actually, a man and a woman, and they were not climbing carefully the way people climbed when they were making a deliberate visit. They were moving with the particular carelessness of people who expected to find no one. Mara set down her hammer and went to the doorway. 2 people came into the clearing, a man of roughly 40 in a wool suit that was badly wrong for this terrain, and a woman a few years younger in a dress and overcoat, both of them breathing hard from the ascent and both of them stopping dead when they saw Mara standing in the doorway of a stone building that was clearly and actively occupied. The man recovered first. He had the face of someone professionally comfortable with awkward situations, which was a specific face Mara associated with lawyers and land agents and people who traded in other people's property. "Miss," he said, "apologies for the interruption. We were under the impression this property was unoccupied." "It's not," Mara said. "No, clearly." He looked at the building, at the new roof, at the repointed walls, at the lumber stacked along the south face. "You've been doing considerable work here." "Yes." "I'm Clement Rauch," he said. "I represent a mining interest out of Denmore. My employer has an interest in acquiring several parcels on Blackthorn Ridge and adjacent ridges, including this one." Mara said nothing. Rauch reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper, folded in thirds. He offered it across the clearing toward her. "My employer is prepared to make a fair offer for the Rourke claim, including compensation for any improvements made to date." He paused. "Given that the original purchase price is $15, the offers we have in mind would be considerably more favorable." Mara looked at the paper, didn't take it. "What's the interest?" she asked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your employer. What's the specific interest in Blackthorn Ridge?" "Silver's played out up here. Has been for 20 years. Rauch's expression shifted slightly. Not much. He was too practiced for much but enough. "There are other mineral interests beyond silver. My employer's specific focus is his own business." "It's my land," Mara said, "which makes it my business too." The woman beside Rauch made a small sound that might have been disagreement or might have been surprise. Rauch himself looked at Mara with the recalibrating expression she was getting familiar with and said, carefully, "No one is questioning your ownership, miss. My employer simply wishes to make an offer. You're under no obligation to accept." "No," Mara agreed. "I'm not." She took the paper. She read it twice while Rauch stood in the clearing and waited, and the woman shifted her weight from foot to foot on the uneven ground. The offer was for $300. $300 was serious money. It was more than most people in Red Willow Crossing would see in 3 years. She was aware of this, and she was aware that Rauch was watching her face while she read and trying to determine whether she understood the sum's significance. She folded the paper. Rauch blinked. "Miss, I think if you consider the figure, I've considered it." She held the paper back out to him. "This property isn't for sale. My employer is flexible on the number, within reason. If 300 is insufficient, the number's not the problem." She kept the paper extended. "He didn't take it yet. My grandfather built his reputation on this ridge. His name is on the courthouse retaining wall and the Meridian Road Bridge footings and half the foundations on Main Street. I'm rebuilding on this property, and I intend to establish the same kind of name here. You can tell your employer I'm not interested, and I won't be interested." A silence. Rauch looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and the woman beside him had stopped shifting her weight and was looking at Smara with an expression that had moved incrementally from neutrality to something harder to categorize. Rauch took the paper. "I'll convey your position," he said. His voice was smooth and professional and entirely empty of anything that might be called a reaction. "If your circumstances change, my employer remains open to discussion." "They won't," Mara said. "But thank you for coming up." They went back down the trail. She watched them go until they rounded the first switchback and were out of sight. And then she stood in the clearing, with the ridge wind moving, and the completed roof above her, and the empty shelves inside waiting to be filled. $300. She turned it over once, considered it as Gideon would have considered it without sentimentality, but without dismissiveness either. Just, what is this actually worth? What would it purchase? What would it cost? And arrived at the same answer she'd given Rauch. She was not hot, a woman who'd carried old tools up a mountain and spent $15 on a broken claim and slept on a boulder for 8 weeks and repointed stone walls 1 6-inch joint at a time, only to sell it to a mining interest for $300. She was not that. Whatever Rauch's employer wanted from Blackthorn Ridge could stay wanting. She went back inside and picked up her hammer and went back to work. The floor was the next project. Packed earth was fine as a subfloor, and many people lived on it their entire lives. But packed earth was cold in winter and damp in seasonal transitions and wore unevenly under foot traffic, and Mara had spent enough time in structures built over packed earth to know what it did to a body over years. She wasn't going to live on it. She'd planned the floor system during the repointing, which had given her long stretches of repetitive work during which her hands were occupied and her mind was free. She'd calculated the board feet, the joist spacing, the notching into the base course of stone, the bridging pattern that would prevent warping. She'd ordered the lumber from Harlan in the 3rd supply run, and Calder had brought it up a week ago, and it was waiting in the lean-to she'd constructed against the south wall, rough-cut pine boards, 2 inches thick on one face. The joists went in first. She notched the bearing points into the base core stones with her chisels, working slowly, checking level with Gideon's hand level, which was a simple but accurate instrument, a glass tube of colored liquid, and 2 reference marks that she'd used on every horizontal surface she'd built since she was 10 years old. Every joist came out level. She'd wanted to rush this. She'd felt it, the pressure of the coming winter, the long list of things still undone, the cold that was already arriving at night with the particular authority of elevation cold, different from valley cold, more serious, more consequential. She'd wanted to work faster. She'd made herself slow down because the floor was the base of everything that happened inside, and a floor that wasn't level would make every piece of furniture, every task, every day of living in this structure slightly and continuously wrong in the way that bad foundations always make themselves known, not dramatically, but insistently. The boarding went faster. She worked from the interior wall out to the perimeter, cutting each board to length with the handsaw, fitting it against its neighbor, driving the cut nails at angles through the board faces, and into the joists below. The sound in the completed space changed as the boards went down. The hollow resonance of an empty building gave way to the duller, warmer acoustic of a finished floor, which told her things about the space that the structural analysis couldn't. It was starting to sound like a home. On the 3rd day of flooring, Harlan Pressey came up the trail. She heard him, for she saw him, the sound of someone climbing with the slightly labored breath of a man who spent his days at a counter, rather than a trail, and she came to the doorway to see him top the last rise, carrying a wrapped bundle under one arm, and looking at the summit clearing, with the expression of someone whose expectations have just been substantially revised. He looked at the roof, at the walls, at the lean-to, at the stacked wood she'd begun laying in firewood, split from the deadfall timber on the north slope, and the stack was already 6 feet long and 4 feet deep, and she'd need at least double that before December. "Harlan," she said. "Miss Whitlock." He looked at the roof again, then at her. "Rach came to see me, Clement Rauch." "That's him. Told me he'd made an offer on this property and you'd declined." He looked at the cleared clearing, the new timber, the completed stone perimeter. He seemed surprised by the declining. He seemed surprised by the building, she said. "Both, probably." Harlan shifted the bundle. "I brought something. Rafter Square. The one on your original list was a smaller size. I had a full-size one come in on the last supply wagon, and I thought you might get more use from it than from the one you ordered." He held it out, a heavy iron square, 12 inches on the short arm, 18 on the long, with stamped degree markings along both faces. Mara looked at it, looked at him. "You came up this trail to bring me a Rafter Square, and to see if the Rourke claims story was as interesting as it sounds." He set square out the skis on the stone wall beside the doorway and looked at the interior through the doorway, at the joists and the half-laid floor. "It's more interesting." He didn't come inside. She hadn't invited him, and she wasn't going to, not because she was suspicious of him, but because the interior was still a work site, and she was possessive of it the way you're possessive of things you're building, before they're finished. But he walked the exterior and looked at the stonework closely and said nothing critical, which was its own form of professional acknowledgement from a hardware man of 30 years. "Rach works for a man named Aldous Grief," Harlan said when he'd completed the circuit, "out of Denmore. Grief buys up marginal mineral properties and waits. Waits for what? For the railroad to come through, or the assay reports to change, or the commodity price to move. He's patient, and he has money, and he's not particularly concerned with what the land looks like when he gets it." Mara looked at the north slope, where the spruce trees were going gold at the tips in the early cold. "What's on Blackthorn Ridge that he wants?" she asked. "I don't know specifically. But the ridge runs the same formation as the Cranmer deposit, which is copper, not silver. Someone assayed this property and found copper in the north face." He shrugged. "That's worth more than $300. She looked at him. "How much more?" "Depends on depth and grade. Could be nothing. Could be substantial." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Amos Rourke's letter, about a man who'd found enough silver to live on, and not much more, and stage 3 was gone, 3 years after his family was gone because he didn't know where else to be. About the mine shafts, she hadn't fully explored yet. She'd cleared the entrance, looked in far enough to verify the structure was stable, and left it alone because there were more immediate priorities. She hadn't been thinking about what was in the ground. She'd been thinking about what was above it. "I'm not going to mine it," she said. "That's not what I'm building here." "I know," Harlan said. "I'm telling you so you understand why Rach will be back." She thought about this. "If someone wanted to assay the north face independently," she said carefully, "who would they contact?" Harlan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, the slight brightening of a man who has just understood that a conversation he thought was going in one direction is going in another. "There's a survey office in Meridian," he said. "Fenn and Associates. They do geological assessments for private parties. Would they come up to a private property if asked? For the right fee, they'd climb the moon." She nodded. Harlan picked up his hat, which he'd set on the stone wall when he'd handed her the Rafter Square. "Rach will make another offer," he said. "Probably higher. He can make as many offers as he likes." Harlan looked at the completed roof one more time. "Your grandfather built my back steps," he said. 26 years ago. They're still plumb." He put his hat on. "The apple doesn't fall far." He went back down the trail. Marsavit stood in the clearing after he'd gone with the new Rafter Square in her hands and the afternoon light going long and golden across the ridge and the wind moving through the spruce with the particular cold undertone that meant the season was. Turning, genuinely turning now, not threatening anymore but arriving. She went back inside and knelt beside the half-laid floor and picked up her hammer. The nails went in clean. The board seated flush. The floor was level. She worked until the light failed completely, and when she stopped, she sat on the completed section of the floor, not the boulder outside, not the hearth surround, not a work surface, the actual floor she had built, inside the structure she had built, with the roof above her, and the repointed walls around her, and the empty shelves waiting, and the iron box with Amos Rourke's coins, and his letter, and Nell's wooden bird, sitting on the hearthstone, precisely where she'd set it 3 months ago. She sat there for a while. The structure was not finished. She had the second fireplace, and the insulation, and the door, the real door, the heavy one she'd designed, with a locking bar and weather stripping, and the kitchen garden enclosure and the woodshed, and probably 40 other things she hadn't put on a list yet. But it was shelter. Real, solid, structural shelter, built from compromised materials and difficult terrain, and $17, and Amos Rourke's extraordinary generosity, and Gideon's voice in her head saying, check the load path, check the mortar, don't cut the notch until you've measured it 4 times. She put her hand flat on the floor she'd built. The pine was smooth and cool and smelled of cut wood and linseed oil. Most of its windows were dark. Outside, the wind picked up, and the temperature dropped another 2 degrees toward what the mountain had in mind for the coming months. Inside, Mara Whitlock was warm. The door went in on a Tuesday, 3 days before the first real snow. Mara knew the snow was coming, the way she'd learned to know most things about the mountain by then, not from any single signal, but from the accumulation of small ones. The way the morning temperature had dropped past the point of discomfort, and into something with more authority behind it. The way the spruce trees on the north slope had gone still in the early hours, the wind dropping off to almost nothing, which on Blackthorn Ridge was not calm, but preparation. The most of the sky had taken on a particular flat whiteness by mid-afternoon that had nothing to do with clouds and everything to do with what was behind them. She'd been planning for the door for 6 weeks, had designed it while she was still laying joists, had ordered the lumber and the iron hardware in the 4th supply run, had been cutting and fitting the components in the evenings when the light was too low for detail masonry work. The door was 2 inches of solid pine in 3 layers faceboards, diagonal cross layer, faceboards again, the grain of each layer running perpendicular to the one below it, which made the whole assembly resistant to warping in a way that single-layer doors never were in mountain humidity. The iron strap hinges had been made to her specification by the blacksmith in Red Willow Crossing, a quiet man named Sutter who'd looked at her drawings for 30 seconds and said he could do it for $4 and delivered them in 5 days without a single deviation from the drawing. Hanging the door alone was a problem she'd thought about carefully. A door that size 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 2 inches of layered pine weighed somewhere between 60 and 70 pounds. The hang required holding the door at exactly the right height and angle while simultaneously driving the hinge pins, which was a 2-person job done the natural way. She didn't have 2 people. She had a forked prop she'd shaped from a birch crotch, a rope guide slung from a timber above the doorway, and a system of temporary peg holes she'd bored into the door frame at hinge height so she could park the door at the right elevation and use both hands for the pins. It took her 4 attempts and most of a morning. On the 3rd attempt, the door slipped off the prop and came down on her left boot. She got the boot out in time, but only barely, and she stood in the doorway for a moment afterward with her heart going fast, and her hands braced on both jambs, and took the 30 seconds she needed to acknowledge that had been close. And then she repositioned the prop, rehung the door, and tried again. The 4th attempt worked. She drove the last hinge pin home, removed the prop, took hold of the pull handle she'd shaped from a curved pine branch, and swung the door. It moved cleanly on the hinges. The lower edge cleared the floor by a 1/4 inch. The latch caught on the first try. She opened it and closed it 4 more times, checking the gap at each edge against the light, verifying the weather stripping she'd packed into the rabbet she'd cut in the frame seated properly all the way around. Then she closed it from the inside and dropped the locking bar. The sound the bar made when it seated in the iron brackets, a solid, definitive wooden thunk, was the most satisfying single sound she had heard in 4 months. She stood inside the sealed structure in the sudden quiet. No wind, no cold air coming under the threshold. The fire in Amos Rourke's hearth was the only source of light, and it was enough, the flame reflecting off the repointed stone walls and the planed pine floor and the shelves she'd built and the table and the bed frame with its rope lattice and stuffed tick mattress. She had a home. Not a finished home, not a comfortable home by any standard she could remember from before, but a sealed, weather-tight, structurally soundstone shelter on a mountain ridge, with a planed floor and a functional hearth and a locking door and empty shelves that she was going to fill. She let herself stand in that for exactly a minute. Then she went back outside to finish stacking the firewood before the snow arrived. The first snow came 2 days later and lasted 36 hours. Not the killing storm she'd been bracing for. That would come later, she knew. The mountain had more serious intentions for January and February, but enough to establish the season's terms. 8 inches on the flat, drifting to 18 against the south face of the shelter where the wind wrapped round the corner. The trails below became uncertain and then impassable for 3 days. She'd been ready. The woodpile was stacked under the lean-to. She'd extended off the east wall, covered with the canvas weighted with stones, dry enough to burn clean. The shelves held flour, dried beans, salt pork, lard, dried fruit, oats, sugar, salt, and a medical tin containing willow bark, yarrow, and the supply of quinine doctor. Orson Pike had sent up with Calder 2 weeks before she hadn't met Pike yet, but his name had come with the medicine, along with a folded note in a doctor's cramped hand, for fever. 2 grains dissolved in water. Don't let yourself run low send word through Calder when the supply drops below a week's worth. Oh, Pike, she'd read the note twice. She'd thought about a man she'd never met, deciding to send medicine to a woman on a mountain, and she'd put the note in the same shelf section as the medicine, and decided that this was the kind of thing she was going to remember. The 3 days of trail closure were the most isolated she'd been since arriving on the ridge. She used them. She built the interior shelf bracket she'd been postponing. She worked on the second fireplace plan, the one she intended for the sleeping area, a smaller unit than the main hearth, built requiring less material, built against the east wall where the stone was thickest. She delayed this until the main structure was sealed because she wanted to see how the main hearth performed through a real cold snap before she committed to the east wall design. What she found was that the main hearth, with its restored clay-lined flue, burned efficiently and threw heat into the main room well, but the sleeping area behind the partition she'd dry-stacked stayed noticeably colder, cold enough to be a problem in serious winter temperatures. The second fireplace was not optional. She spent the 3 closed days drawing the design in fine detail, calculating the firebox dimensions, the throat geometry, the flue height, insisting. And the connection to the existing chimney stack, she planned to share the stack rather than build a second one, which was more efficient and structurally simpler. The junction would require careful work. She drew it from 3 angles. On the 4th day, the trail opened enough for her to get down to the first water source and back. On the 6th day, she started cutting the opening in the east wall for the new firebox. Cutting into a standing stone wall was not work you did quickly or carelessly. Every cut changed the load path. Every removed stone had to be considered in terms of what it was carrying and what would carry it once it was gone. She built a temporary timber shore inside the wall opening. Before she touched a single stone, the shore held the courses above the intended opening, transferring their load to the floor temporarily while she worked out the permanent solution. The permanent solution was a lintel. She needed a piece of stone long enough to bridge the firebox opening with enough bearing on each side to carry the courses above at least 8 inches of bearing on a piece that had to span 30 inches, meaning the stone had to be at minimum 46 inches long and thick enough not to crack under the load above. She'd found it already, or rather she'd been looking at it for 2 months without recognizing what she had, a piece of the north slope granite partially buried, that she'd been using as a step up to the lean-to doorway. She'd have to move her step. Digging the granite out took most of a day. The stone was embedded deeper than it always was, and the frozen ground complicated the excavation. She chipped it free with the pry bar and the stone hammer, working around the perimeter, loosening it incrementally, until she could get the lever underneath and break it free from the earth that had been holding it for probably decades. The stone was 53 inches long, 7 inches thick, 14 inches wide. It was almost exactly what she needed. She cut it to 48 inches with the stone chisel, dressing the ends square then worked the bearing surfaces on each face until they were flat enough to seat without rocking. She tested the fit twice in a dry run before she mortared anything. When the lintel went in, it seated perfectly. She stared at it for a while, the way she stared at things she'd calculated and then built, and then had the slightly vertiginous experience of seeing exist in physical reality. The east wall firebox took her. The flue junction required 3 days of that, working inside the existing chimney stack with a lamp and a mirror to see the connection angles, packing fire clay into the junction in layers that she let cure between applications, because rushing a flue junction was how you got a carbon monoxide situation or a chimney fire, and she was not going to rush a flue junction. She lit the east wall fireplace for the first time on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees. The draw was clean from the first match. The smoke went up and out the way it was supposed to, without spillage, without hesitation, which was not guaranteed even with a well-designed system on first lighting. Sometimes you had to establish the thermal column in the flue before the draw found its rhythm, but this one drew immediately and cleanly, and the flame settled into the firebox, and the heat began to move into the sleeping area within 20 minutes. She sat on the bed and held the heat reach her palms and thought about Gideon, who had taught her flue geometry, on a kitchen fireplace rebuilt when she was 11 years old. She thought about the fact that she could not have done any of this without him. She thought about all the ways inheritance was not about property. Then she went to sleep in a warm room for the first time since she'd left Red Willow Crossing. She slept 11 hours. It was Etta who brought the news about Rausch. Not in person this time. The trails in November were uncertain enough that Etta didn't make the climb. But she sent a letter with Calder on one of his freight runs, a short practical note in the wide, no-nonsense handwriting of a woman who had been writing practical notes all her life. Rach came to see me. Asked about you, your background, your family, your financial situation. I told him your background was none of his business, and your financial situations was clearly better than he'd expected. He asked if you had backing. I told him the backing you have is your own 2 hands, and if that wasn't sufficient information, he could go ask somebody else. He won't come to you again soon, but he's still in town. E.B. Mara read the letter twice. She sat at her table with the letter in front of her and a cup of spruce needle tea, not because she preferred it to coffee. She didn't. But the coffee was running low, and she was rationing it, and thought about Aldous Grief's patience. About a man who waited for mineral prices to move and railroad routes to shift and property holders to become desperate. About the fact that she was not and was not planning to become desperate. But she thought about the assay. She'd been thinking about it since Harlan had mentioned Fenn and Associates. She hadn't acted on it yet, because there had always been something more immediate: the east wall fireplace, the door, the firewood, the foods, doors, and because she was genuinely uncertain what she wanted to know. If the north face showed copper and she knew about it, the knowledge changed things. It made the property something different in her mind, something with a market value rather than just a structural and personal one. She wasn't sure she wanted the property to have a market value. She was afraid of what that might do to how she thought about it. She folded Etta's letter and put it with Amos's letter in the metal box on the hearthstone. 2 letters now. Different handwriting, different decades. Same box. She made a decision about the assay. She would commission it, and she would know what she had, because not knowing what you had was not a virtue. It was avoidance. Gideon had never avoided knowing the condition of a structure because the condition might be bad. You knew what you had, and then you decided what to do with the knowledge, and those were 2 separate decisions that should not be collapsed into one. She wrote to Fenn and Associates that week. Dr. Orson Pike came up the mountain in early December. This surprised her more than Etta's visit had, because Etta's visit had been flagged by Calder in advance, and because Etta was the kind of person who made the kind of effort a mountain trail required as a matter of personal policy. Pike, from his note, and from what she'd gathered from various mentions in the town's loose communications, was a man in his late 60s who had been practicing medicine in Red Willow Crossing for 30 years, and who had, by all accounts, bad knees. He came up anyway. She saw him before. He reached the summit clearing. She'd developed the habit of watching the trail from the window she'd cut in the south wall, a small opening with an oilskin shutter that let in light and let her see what was coming, because the Rauhawk visit had made her more attentive to unexpected arrivals. Pike was a tall, angular man who climbed the trail with the specific economy of motion of someone managing knee pain, each step placed carefully, the weight shift deliberate, no wasted movement. He carried a leather bag that she recognized immediately as a doctor's case, and he was wearing a heavy wool coat and a hat that had seen a considerable amount of weather. She went to meet him at the top of the last rise. He looked at her, looked at the structure behind her, looked at the repointed walls and the new roof and the smoke coming from the chimney in the still December air. "Dr. Pike," she said. "Miss Whitlock." He transferred the doctor's bag to his left hand and extended his right, which she shook. His grip was firm. His eyes, which were the specific shade of gray that comes with age rather than being born into, were direct and without any of the various forms of performance she'd been receiving from people who made this climb. "I wanted to see it for myself," he said. "Medicine I can send with Calder. The rest you have to come and see." "What rest?" "Whether you're actually all right up here." He looked at her hands, which were calloused and cracked and had a fresh abrasion on the right palm from a chisel slip 2 days ago. Then at her face, with the particular clinical attention of someone who has spent decades reading faces for things people don't volunteer. "You have lost weight. I've been working hard, I know. That's why I'm here." He held up the bag. "Will you let me take a look?" She almost said no. The instinct was sharp and familiar, the instinct she'd developed over years of people examining her body and finding it wanting, the reflex of preemptive refusal before they could deliver a verdict she hadn't asked for. She stood with that instinct for a moment, recognized it for what it was rather than what it pretended to be, and said, "Come inside." Pike examined her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who has examined a great many people and has no personal investment in any particular finding. He looked at her hands and the abrasion and the callus pattern. He checked her eyes and the color under her lower eyelids for anemia. He asked about her diet, what she was eating, how much, how often, and listened to her answers without editorializing. He asked about sleep quality, about joint pain, specifically her knees and hips, because the trail grade and the amount of squatting and kneeling that stonemason work required put specific demands on specific structures. Her knees were fine. Her hips had been bothering her on the left side for 3 weeks, a dull ache that came on after a long day of mortar work and went away after an hour of heat. She mentioned this because he asked. He nodded, bursitis probably. The kneeling on stone. He opened the bag and produced a small tin. "Comfrey salve. Work it into the joint before you sleep. And if you can, put something between your knees and the stone when you're working low courses. Even a folded piece of canvas makes a difference." "I know," she said. "I've been too impatient to stop and get it." He looked at her with a slight, specific expression, not quite amusement, not quite exasperation. The most common reason people don't take care of themselves is that they're too busy taking care of everything else. He closed the bag. "How's the food situation?" "Adequate. I'm rationing coffee." "Understandable." He looked around the interior at the shelves, the fireplace, the floor, the partition wall, the hanging oil lamp. For a moment, he was quiet, the way people went quiet when they were taking in something that didn't fit the category they'd filed it in. "When Calder told me what you'd built up here, I thought he was exaggerating." "Calder doesn't exaggerate." "No," Pike agreed. "He really doesn't." He looked at the hearthstone, at the metal box sitting in the corner of it, which she hadn't moved and hadn't hidden. He didn't ask about it. "How old are you, Miss Whitlock?" 18. He was quiet for another moment. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, he said. "I've seen a considerable number of people in a considerable number of circumstances. Most people who arrive somewhere without resources either find help or collapse. Very few build." He looked at the lintel above the east wall doorway, the one she'd cut and dressed and set herself. "What you've done here," as he paused, selecting the word unusual. "My grandfather taught me." "Gideon Whitlock," Pike said, not a question. "Everyone seems to know his name." "He set the foundation on my surgery," Pike said. 18 years ago. I was new in town and couldn't afford the best materials, and he charged me 3/4 of what he could have and did the same quality of work." He picked up his bag. "I've been repaying it when I can in various ways. This is one of them." He went to the door, stopped. "You're going to need company this winter," he said. "Not for practical reasons. You're clearly managing the practical. For other reasons, she looked at him. Isolation does things to people, he said simply. It's not weakness, it's physiology. Keep the fire going and the shelves stocked, and all the rest of it you'll be fine physically. But make sure Calder comes by when he can, and don't refuse visitors because you feel like you ought to be managing alone. She thought about saying that she was fine managing alone, that she'd been managing alone from the moment she'd walked out of Raymond's kitchen. She thought about saying this and recognized, with the slight internal embarrassment of recognizing something accurate, that it was dark, that it was the kind of thing you said when you were determined not to need anything rather than when you actually didn't need anything. All right, she said. He looked at her once more with those weathered gray eyes. Gideon raised someone good, he said, and then he went out the door and down the trail, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, the doctor's bag swinging at his side, each step on the trail placed with that careful economy that managed his knees while still being steady. She stayed in the doorway after he was out of sight. The December air was sharp, and the sky above the ridge was the particular deep blue of high altitude in winter, and the spruce trees were weighted with the snow from the last storm, and the woodpile under the canvas looked solid and sufficient, and the smoke from her chimney went straight up into the still air in a thin white line. She was going to need company this winter, Pike had said. She went inside and got her canvas knee pad from the lumber offcuts pile where she'd put it months ago and not used. She folded it twice. She knelt on it on the sleeping area floor and felt the difference immediately, the cold stone's edge, still there but muffled, the pressure distributed rather than concentrated. Simple. Obvious. Something she'd known and not done because she was always moving to the next thing. She knelt on the canvas and thoughts about Pike's other observation that the most common reason people didn't take care of themselves was that they were too busy taking care of everything else. She thought about her mother, who had worked double shifts at the laundry to pay for Mara's school books, and who had worn the same coat for 9 winters and died at 42 of a fever that a doctor might have caught earlier if she'd made the appointment she'd been putting off. She thought about Gideon, who had worked until his hands barely closed around a chisel and who had died at 78 of what the doctor called heart failure and what Mara privately called the accumulated cost of 4 decades of stonework in all weather. She thought about what it meant to build something solid while neglecting the structure doing the building. Then she picked up her hammer and went back to work and used the canvas pad every time she knelt. Rauch came back on a Thursday. She knew it was him before she saw his face. She recognized his climb pattern from the south window, the suit jacket shape of him on the trail, the particular way he moved on steep terrain, like a man who spent his life at desks and resented the temporary inconvenience of hills. He wasn't alone this time. He had a second man with him she didn't recognize, shorter and broader, in working clothes rather than office clothes, carrying what looked like a rolled paper under one arm. She was at the doorway when they topped the rise. "Mr. Rauch," she said. "Miss Whitlock." He looked, if possible, even more like a man making a professional effort to appear pleasant than he had the first time. "I apologize for arriving without notice. The trail makes sending ahead impractical." "It does," she agreed. She did not invite him in. He seemed to have prepared for this. He stopped a few feet from the doorway and gestured toward the second man. "This is Marsh. He assists my employer with mineral assessments." Mara looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at the north slope with the particular orientation of a man looking for something specific. "My employer has had some initial surveys done," Rauch said, on the adjacent parcels. "The geological picture suggests some interesting formations on this ridge." He paused. "The offer we discussed previously, $300, my employer, is prepared to revise it substantially. He's authorized me to present $500 for the parcel as currently improved." $500. The air was cold and clear, and Mara could hear the wind picking up in the spruce trees on the north slope, and she could smell snow coming, probably tonight. And she looked at Clement's professionally pleasant face and thought about Aldous Grief's patience, and about copper in the North Face Formation, and about the letter she'd sent to Fenn and Associates 3 weeks ago that had not yet received a reply. "I've commissioned my own geological assessment," she said. Rauch blinked. "Have you?" "I sent to Fenn and Associates in Meridian. I expect a response before the new year." The professional pleasantness on Rauch's face underwent a complicated internal process. She could see the calculation happening, the reassessment, the adjustment of expected difficulty, the upward revision of the number he'd probably been authorized to go to if necessary. "That's prudent," he said finally. "My employer respects due diligence. I'm sure he does." She looked at Marsh, who had not stopped orienting toward the north slope. "Your associate can stop looking. He's on my property and he's not going to assess anything today." Marsh looked at her. He had the face of a man who was used to women speaking to him differently than this. He looked at Rauch. Rauch cleared his throat. "Of course. We're here entirely in a social capacity." "You're here in a professional capacity," Mara said, "which is fine. But the assessment is mine to commission, and the decision is mine to make, and I haven't made it yet. When I have, I'll let you know through Harlan Precy." A pause. "Through Harlan," Rauch repeated. "He'll know how to reach you." Rauch looked at the structure behind her, the sealed walls, the new roof, the woodpile, the lean-to, all of it, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he'd underestimated and is now repricing in real time. Then he put his hat back on, which he'd removed when he reached the top of the trail. "We appreciate your time," he said. They went back down. She stood in the doorway after they were gone and let the mountain air run cold across her face and thought about $500 and thought about copper and thought about what Gideon would have said, which was, "Know what you have before you sell it and know what you need before you buy anything." She needed to know what she had. The reply from Fenn and Associates came with Calder on a Tuesday in the last week of December, a 2-page letter from a man who signed himself H. Fenn Geological Survey, which described his firm's preliminary interest in the project and quoted a fee for an on-site assessment and noted that the earliest he could send a team was the second week of February, weather permitting. He also noted in a postscript that was either professionally casual or deliberately offhand in a way designed to seem casual, if the Rourke claim parcel shows the formation characteristics typical of the adjacent Blackthorn Ridge geology, an assessment may be of considerable value to the property holder. She read the postscript 4 times. She wrote back the same day, confirming the February date and paying the assessment fee from the metal box $40, the largest single expenditure she'd made from Amos Rourke's savings. And she was careful about it, noting the amount and the purpose on the piece of paper she kept inside the box lid as an account of every dollar she'd spent and what she'd spent it on. The account now showed that she'd used $212 of Amos's savings in total. She reviewed it regularly, the way Gideon had reviewed his ledger, not to feel guilty about spending, but to stay honest about where the money was going, and whether where it was going was where it should be going. $212 had built a sealed stone home with a functional double fireplace system, a planed pine floor, fitted shelving, solid furniture, a new roof with cedar shingles, and enough provisions to survive a mountain winter. She found this, when she let herself look at it, squarely remarkable. Not because she'd been thrifty, though she had been, but because the money had not bought comfort or ease. It had bought the specific things that made survival possible, which was what Amos had left it for. And she had honored that purpose down to the last item on the account page. The snow came hard in January. Not a single storm, but a series of them, arriving every 4 or 5 days, one after another, the way mountain winter worked, when it was serious, not dramatic, but relentless, piling up incrementally, the drifts growing against the south wall, the trail below the ridge becoming first uncertain and then gone. The temperature dropped to levels that made the morning fire not comfort but necessity, the cold coming through the walls in a way she could feel, despite the repointing, finding the gaps in those were dark, finding the gaps in insulation she'd packed between the inner partition and the stone and making her note the places that needed attention in spring. She was warm, broadly. The 2 fireplaces working together kept the interior at a temperature she could live in without hardship, and the firewood supply she'd built through the fall was holding well. She was burning less than she'd planned for, which meant she'd calculated conservatively, which was what Gideon would have called correct. But Pike had been right about the other thing. The isolation was different in winter than it had been in the building season. During the building season, the work had been dense enough and demanding enough that solitude was simply the condition in which the work happened. She hadn't been lonely because she'd been too focused. Winter was different. The work was still their maintenance, food preparation, the ongoing small repairs and improvements that any structure required, but it was less total. It left gaps. Evenings by the fire when the wind was up, and the temperature outside was single digits, and the trail was buried and there was no possibility of visitors. She filled the gaps the way she filled most gaps. Practically. She read. Etta had sent up 3 books with Calder in November, a natural history of the mountain territories, a practical guide to cold climate horticulture, and a novel she'd included, without explanation, that turned out to be the kind of story where complicated people did complicated things in a city she'd never visited, and which was so entirely unlike her own circumstances that she found it absorbing in the way that total contrast can be absorbing. She drew plans. The kitchen she wanted to build, in spring a walled enclosure on the south face to catch maximum sun, the wall built from the stone she'd cleared from the dugout, the beds elevated to keep the root zone out of the frost layer. The second lean-to she needed on the north side for tool storage, the drainage improvements around the foundation perimeter, which was the one structural element she'd identified as needing attention before the spring thaw turned the ground to mud. She maintained the records in the metal box. She took the comfrey salve Pike had left and worked it into her hip every night before she slept, which helped more than she'd expected, the ache fading from chronic to occasional over 3 weeks. She talked to Nell's wooden bird sometimes. She was aware this was strange. She didn't stop. What she said to it was not remarkable, nothing she'd have been embarrassed to say out loud to another person, nothing particularly emotional. Just the ordinary commentary of a person working through problems. I need to recalculate the spring G sequence. Or the east rafter might need repegging before summer. Or Calder should be here Thursday if the trail opens. She wasn't sure why she said it to the bird rather than to herself, except that saying it to the bird made it feel marginally less like talking to herself, which was the windows were dark, which was the kind of distinction that matters more in a winter on a mountain than it would ever matter anywhere else. Calder came when he could. The routes that kept him moving through winter bypassed the Blackthorn Ridge trail most of the time, but every 2 to 3 weeks he'd make the detour, appearing at the top of the trail with his pack mule and whatever supplies Etta had assembled, and a face that registered nothing about the cold or the grade or the effort except the slight compression around his eyes that was his version of acknowledgement that the terrain was working against him. He never stayed long in winter. The light was short and the trail uncertain, and his mules needed to be back below the snow line by dark. But he'd sit with her for an hour, drink the coffee she'd been carefully rationing, and talk, which for Calder meant saying perhaps 40 words in an hour, but making all 40 count. He told her in February that Rauch was still in Red Willow Crossing. Staying where? She asked. Etta's boarding house, ironically. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. She charged him the full rate and didn't ask him any questions he wasn't volunteering, which is her way. He's waiting for my assessment results. Probably. Calder looked at the fire. Grief sent a man to the county assessor's office in Meridian 2 weeks ago. Aldrich told me. Requested copies of the mineral survey data for the Blackthorn Ridge parcels. The public data. She looked at him. He's building a picture. Yes. He thinks if he knows what's in the ground before I do, he can make an offer before I know the number's low. Calder said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. She thought about H. Fenn's team due in the 2nd week of February. She thought about the North Slope and the Copper Formation and the account page in the metal box. I'm not selling, she said. I know, Calder said, not urging her, not affirming her, just acknowledging the fact of it the way he acknowledged most facts. She looked at the wooden sparrow on the hearthstone. Amos built this place for someone who needed it, she said. He didn't build it for a mining interest out of Denmore. Calder looked at the sparrow too. No, he said. He didn't. They drank the rest of the coffee in silence, which was a good silence, the kind that had been built up over months of shorter silences and didn't need filling. When he left, she walked him to the top of the trail and watched him start down with the mule, and the wind was coming from the north with real intent behind it, and the sky was the flat white of incoming snow. She stood at the top of Blackthorn Ridge in January, cold with her hands in her coat pockets, and felt not happy. Exactly. Because happy was the wrong word for what she was but located. She felt located, placed, rooted in a specific piece of ground in a way that had nothing to do with Aldous grief, or Copper Formation, or the number on the account page in the metal box. She went back inside. She put more wood on the fire. She sat at her table with the plan drawings for the spring kitchen garden spread out in front of her and a pencil in her hand, and she began working out the drainage fall for the south-facing wall. The snow started an hour later, soft and consistent, and it covered the summit in white silence, and the smoke from Mara Whitlock's chimney went straight up into the gray sky above Blackthorn Ridge. And inside the stone walls Amos Rourke had built, and she had rebuilt, the fire in the restored hearth burned steady and clean and warm. H. Fenn arrived on a Wednesday, in the second week of February, which was the date he'd promised, and which Mara had not entirely believed until she saw him top the rise. He was younger than she'd expected from the letter, mid-30s, with the lean look of a man who spent more time outdoors than his correspondence suggested. He'd brought 2 assistants, both carrying equipment cases that clanked with instruments she recognized partially and partially didn't. They wore proper mountain gear, which told her something about how seriously they took the work. Marsh Grief's man had worn office boots on a mountain in November. Fenn's people wore oiled leather with proper lacing. She offered them coffee, which she'd been saving specifically for this meeting, and they accepted. Fenn stood inside the main room and looked at the hearth and the floor and the partition and the shelves and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You built this, I did." He looked at the lintel above the east wall opening, which was a piece of work he clearly recognized as requiring skill. Then at the repointed exterior walls he'd passed on the way in. Then back at her. "I had a different picture," he said. "Everyone does," Mara said. He almost smiled at that. He sat down at her table with his coffee and opened a leather map case and spread a survey sheet across the table's surface. It was a topographical rendering of Blackthorn Ridge and the surrounding formations, with the Rourke claim boundaries drawn in ink and the adjacent parcels noted. There were pencil annotations she couldn't from her side of the table. "We'll spend 2 days on the north slope," he said. "Possibly 3, depending on what the first day shows. I'll give you a preliminary report before we leave and a full written assessment within 3 weeks." He looked at the map. The adjacent parcel to the north, the Crail property, which was part of the Denmore Group's acquisition last fall, shows some encouraging copper indicators in the surface geology. The question is whether the formation continues south onto your parcel, and if so, at what depth and grade. And if it does, he looked up, then your property is worth considerably more than what Grief is offering. She looked at the map, at the pencil lines, at the boundary between the Rourke claim and the Crail property that Grief had already bought. "If I commission this assessment and the results are significant," she said, "Grief will want them. He'll try to get the data." Fenn put his coffee cup down. "The assessment belongs to you. The results belong to you. I don't share client data without written authorization. What if he pressures your firm? He's welcome to try." Fenn's voice was perfectly flat. "My firm has been operating in this territory for 19 years. We've dealt with Grief before on other properties. He's persistent and he has resources. He's also not our only client and not someone we're dependent on." He held her gaze. "Your results stay yours." She believed him. Not because she was naive, she wasn't. Not after 6 months on this mountain, but because his response had the specific quality of a man stating a policy rather than making a promise. Policies had structural integrity. Promises were only as strong as the person making them on any given day. "Start on the north slope," she said. "I'll show you the entrance to the mine shaft this morning. It's been cleared, but I haven't gone deep." Fenn's first day on the north slope was long. He and his assistants were up before her and, working before the light was fully established, moving along the rock face with the methodical attention of people who had done this hundreds of times in dozens of locations and had developed a fluency with geological reading that she recognized and respected because it was analogous to the way. She read structures the same principle of learning to see what a surface was telling you rather than what you expected it to say. She stayed out of their way. She had her own work, the drainage improvements she'd been planning all winter, the foundation perimeter channels that needed to be cut and packed before the spring thaw turned the ground around the structure to mud. She worked on the south and east sides of the shelter all day, digging the channels with a machaca she'd had Calder bring up in January, cutting through the frozen crust to the softer earth below. shaping the drainage fall she'd designed in the drawings she'd made by firelight in December. At midday, Fen came back to the clearing and stood watching her work for a moment. "The shaft," he said. "How far in did Rourke go?" "Maybe 60 feet, possibly more. I haven't measured it end to end." She set the mattock down. "The timbering's still standing in the first 40 feet. After that, I don't know. I didn't go that far without knowing the structural condition." Fen nodded. "We'll go in tomorrow. Today I want to finish the surface reading." He looked at the drainage channel she was cutting. "That's the right fall for this slope." She looked at him. "The grade," he said. "The drainage fall you're cutting. It's the right angle for this slope. A lot of people cut drainage flat and wonder why the water still pools." She looked at the channel. "My grandfather showed me. Gideon Whitlock." She stared at him. "How do you know that name?" "I went to school with his apprentice," Fen said simply. "Delbert Crane. You probably don't know him. He left this territory 15 years ago for the coast. But he talked about Gideon Whitlock the way some people talk about their fathers. Said he'd never worked with a better builder." He looked at the structure again. "I see the education." He went back to the north slope. She stood at the drainage channel with the mattock in her hand and a cold that had nothing to do with February in the center of her chest, which she recognized as the particular kind of grief that ambushes you sideways. The kind that isn't triggered by thinking about the person directly, but by suddenly, unexpectedly, encountering evidence that they existed in the world outside your own memory of them. That Gideon had been real to other people. That other people had learned from him. That his teaching was still running through the world in forms he'd never know about. She picked up the mattock and kept cutting. Fen's team spent 2 full days on the north slope and 4 hours in the mine shaft on the 3rd morning. She heard them in there, the occasional sound of equipment, a voice now and then, and she worked on the drainage and didn't hover and didn't ask questions they weren't ready to answer. She'd learned, from Gideon and from months of her own building work, that good assessment required undisturbed concentration and that the worst thing you could do to someone doing careful technical work was interrupt them with questions born from your own anxiety. On the 3rd afternoon, Fen came to the table with his preliminary notes. He sat down. He organized his papers. He looked at her in the direct way he'd looked at her since the first morning. "The surface geology on the north face shows copper-bearing formation consistent with the Crail parcel to your north," he said. "The mineralization is clearly present at surface level. The question of depth and grade required the shaft inspection." He paused. "We went 68 feet in. The timbering holds to about 50 feet, after which there's a partially collapsed section not dangerous, but it requires work before deep access is practical. Beyond the collapse, the shaft continues. We couldn't assess the far end, but based on the surface indicators and what we saw in the first accessible section, the formation appears to continue into your property at increasing depth." Mara said nothing. "What this means," Fen said, "is that the copper formation Grief is interested in does not terminate at your northern boundary. His parcel has the surface expression. Your parcel potentially has the depth." He set his pencil down. "A surface copper deposit without depth access is of limited value. A deep formation accessed from below from your shaft significantly changes the picture for both parcels." She looked at the map on the table. "He knows this," she said. "His man Marsh has done enough surface work to suspect it. He doesn't know your shaft condition, and he doesn't know how far the formation extends into your parcel because he hasn't been inside your property." Fen looked at her. "You have information he wants and can't get without your cooperation or your departure." She thought about Rauch, still at Etta's boarding house, about patience as a strategy, about a man who waited for property holders to become desperate. "My full written assessment will include the depth projections and the grade estimates," Fen said. "It will also include a market valuation based on comparable formations in this territory." He paused. "That number will be considerably higher than $500. She looked at him steadily. "How considerably?" he told her. She sat with that number for a moment. It was not the kind of number that changed what she intended to do. She had decided months ago, standing in the doorway of this rebuilt shelter with Amos Rosick's letter in her hands, that what she was building here was not an investment vehicle. It was a home. It was a livelihood. It was the ground she'd decided to build her life on, and that decision didn't become negotiable because a geologist put a large number next to it. But it was the kind of number that changed how she would conduct the next conversation with Clement Rauch. Fenn's team left on the morning of the fourth day. At the top of the trail, Fenn stopped and turned back. "Whatever you decide," he said, "get legal representation before you engage with Grief directly." He has lawyers, and he knows how to structure negotiations that seem straightforward and aren't. He looked at the shelter behind her. "This property is worth protecting properly." "I know a name in Meridian," she said. Harlan mentioned someone. He nodded once. 3 weeks for the full report. "I'll send it with the county courier." She watched him go down the trail with his assistants and their clanking equipment cases, and then she turned back to the shelter and stood in the clearing and looked at the structure she'd built, the walls, the roof, the sealed door with its iron strap hinges made to her specification, and she understood, in a way that was not triumphant and not simple, that what had happened in the last 3 days had permanently changed the terms of everything. The copper changed nothing about what she wanted. It changed everything about what she had to protect. She went inside and sat at the table and wrote 4 letters that afternoon, one to Harlan asking for the name of the solicitor in Meridian, one to Etta telling her what Fenn had found and asking for nothing, one to Calder asking him to come up when the trail allowed because she needed to talk through a route question, and one to Dr. Pike that simply said, "I'm well. The hip is better. Thank you for the canvas pad advice." She sent them all with the supply run 3 days later. Rauch came back in March. The trails were uncertain in early March. The thaw was beginning but hadn't committed. The kind of transitional period where a day of warm sun could be followed by a night that refroze everything and made the mud sections glass. He came up anyway, which told her something about how seriously Grief was taking the assessment he hadn't been able to commission. She was working on the kitchen garden wall when she heard the trail. She kept working. She was fitting the corner stones of the enclosure, dry stacking, because the garden wall didn't need mortar, and dry stacking allowed adjustment, and the cornerstones needed careful selection because a dry stack corner that wasn't well fitted would shift in the first heavy rain. She heard Rauch reach the clearing. She heard him stop when he saw her. She set the stone she was holding, checked the fit, adjusted it a 1/4 inch, checked again. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "Mr. Rauch." She picked up the next stone. She heard him walk toward her. He stopped a few feet away. She could feel him watching her work, the selection of the stone, the placement, the slight adjustment. She didn't stop. "My employer has received information," Rauch said carefully, suggesting that a geological assessment has recently been conducted on this property. "That's accurate," she said. "He'd be interested in the results." "I'm sure he would." She set the stone. "He can commission his own assessment of his own property." A pause. "Miss Whitlock, if the formation data indicates what my employer believes it indicates, the value of this property changes substantially. He's prepared to reflect that in an offer." She stood up then. Not because she was angry, she wasn't angry, exactly. She was clear, which was different. She looked at Rauch directly, and she could see him process the fact that the woman he'd met in November, who'd been working in a half-rebuilt structure with cold hands and provisions on a shelf, was not the woman standing in front of him now. The woman in front of him had been on this mountain through a full winter. The woman in front of him had built everything behind her and was currently building the stone wall of a kitchen garden with the specific unhurried competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Mr. Rauch," she said, "I have a solicitor in Meridian. Her name is Dorothea Vance. If your employer wants to make a formal offer for this property, he can present it to her in writing, and she'll present it to me, and I'll decide whether it's worth reading." She picked up the next stone. "What I'm not going to do is have informal conversations in my garden about offers I haven't seen yet from a man I've never met." Rauch was quiet for a moment. "Dorothea Vance," he said. Yes, he knew the name. She could see that. Whatever Dorothea Vance's reputation was in Meridian, it was sufficient to make Clement Rauch recalibrate his afternoon's plan. "I'll convey that to my employer," he said. "Thank you," Mara said, and went back to her stones. He left without another word. She listened to his footsteps diminish down the trail, and then she set down the stone she was holding and pressed both hands flat on the top course of the garden wall she'd built and took a slow breath and then another one. Her hands were not shaking this time. Dorothea Vance turned out to be a woman of 51 who had been practicing law in Meridian for 23 years, and who Harlan had written, the specific reputation of being the person you hired when someone with more money than you was trying to take something that was legally yours. She charged fair rates, kept straight books, and as Harlan had put it with the economy of a man who trusted facts over flourishes, she wins. Mara had written to her in February, before Fenn's team arrived, at Harlan's recommendation. The reply had been prompt and direct. She would take the matter. She would review the property documents and the assessment results when available. And her fee structure was as follows. The fee structure was fair. Mara had agreed by return letter. When Fenn's full written assessment arrived early March, delivered by county courier to Mara's address on Blackthorn Ridge, which was now a recognized address on the county route, she made 2 copies by hand, which took her the better part of 2 evenings by firelight, and sent 1 copy to Dorothea Vance and kept the original in the metal box. The box now held Amos Rourke's letter, the count page, Etta's letter from November, Pike's medicine note, Fenn's assessment, the original deed to the Rourke claim. She added a new page to the account record, noting the assessment fee and Vance's retainer. The account was no longer just a record of building expenses. It was becoming something else, the paper architecture of a property she was actively defending. 2 weeks after she sent the assessment to Vance, a formal written offer from Aldous Grief arrived through the Meridian legal post. She didn't open it. She forwarded it directly to Vance unopened, as they'd agreed. Vance's response when it came was 3 pages. The first page summarized Grief's offer, which was $800. The second page analyzed the offer against Fenn's assessment and the market comps Vance had independently researched. The third page was Vance's recommendation, which was a single sentence. The offer is approximately 40% of the property's assessed value and should be declined. Mara wrote back, declined. Spring arrived properly in April, which on Blackthorn Ridge meant the snow retreated from the south-facing surfaces first, and the north slope stayed white into May, and the trail below became mud and then firmed, and the world below the ridge began to move again after winter's stoppage. She planted the kitchen garden in late April. The walled enclosure she'd built in March caught enough reflected heat from the south-facing stones to extend the growing season. By what she estimated was 3 to 4 weeks. She'd read this in the cold climate horticulture book Etta had sent, confirmed it with Pike in a letter, and designed the enclosure specifically to exploit the effect. She planted root vegetables and leafy greens and 4 varieties of herb and a row of garlic along the south-facing wall base. She stood in the garden on the planting day with her hands dirty to the wrist and looked at the structure she'd built the shelter, the lean-tos, the woodshed she'd added in February, the drainage channels, the garden wall, and tried to see it the way someone arriving for the first time would see it. Not a claim, not a ruin, not a desperate girl's last option. A property, a home, a working enterprise on a mountain ridge, built from stone and timber, and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had taught her everything that mattered while she was young enough to absorb it without knowing she was being taught. Calder had started calling it Whitlock Hold. Sometime in March, she didn't know when exactly, because it happened gradually the way names do, first in a casual reference, then again, then it was just what it was. When Harlan's next supply delivery arrived, the address on the crate was written, Whitlock Hold, Blackthorn Ridge. She'd stood with that crate for a long time. In May, she took her first paid job. Etta had mentioned in a letter in April that the Delano family on the North Road had a chimney in serious need of rebuilding. The fireback had cracked through winter, and the flue was drawing badly, which in a wooden house was not an inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe. Etta had mentioned Mara's name. The Delanos had sent a letter. She went down the mountain for the first time since early winter. Red Willow Crossing was disorienting in the way that re-entering a place after a long absence is always disorienting, not because the place had changed substantially, but because she had, and the mismatch between her memory of the town and the actual town was a measure of that change. The streets were the same width. The buildings were the same buildings. But she moved through it differently. And people looked at her differently. And both of those things were real. Aldrich was in front of the land office when she walked down Main Street. He looked at her. She looked at him. He nodded slightly awkwardly, and she nodded back without slowing down. Harlan was in front of his store and said, Miss Whitlock, with the specific warmth of a man greeting someone whose reputation has been established in his hearing over several months. Etta came out of the boarding house when Mara knocked and embraced Andis, which was not something Mara had expected, and which she stood inside for a moment before her arms remembered what to do. "You look well," Etta said, stepping back and looking at her. "I am well." "You look like someone who spent a winter on a mountain." "That's also true." Etta looked at her hands, at the calloused palms, and the chemical scarring from the lime and the current abrasions from the garden work. She didn't say anything about them. She made coffee and fed Mara the best meal she'd eaten since the last time she'd been in this kitchen, and they talked for 2 hours about the winter, Ets and the assessment, and Vance and the offer Mara had declined. Etta listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of her particular skills, not that passive listening of someone waiting for a pause to speak, but active listening, the kind where you could feel the person tracking the logic of what you were saying and processing it rather than just receiving it. When Mara finished, Etta said, "He'll come back with a higher number." "I know." "What will you do when he does?" Mara thought about this. "Decline that too, probably. Unless it's a number that represents actual fair value, which I don't think he'll offer, because he's not in the business of paying fair value. And if he does something other than offer money." Mara looked at her. "What do you mean?" Etta was quiet for a moment. Grief has acquired 8 properties in this territory in the last 4 years. 3 of them were straightforward purchases. 2 were purchased from estates the owners died and the heirs sold. 1 was acquired after a prolonged legal dispute over the original title that the original owner eventually couldn't afford to continue fighting. She set down her coffee cup. "He's patient, and he's systematic, and he has more money than you for the legal side." Mara sat with this. "You think he'll challenge the title?" she said. "I think Vance should check the title history thoroughly, if she hasn't already." She wrote to Vance that week. Vance had already checked. Her reply, which came in the 3rd week of May, was thorough and precise. The title chain on the Rourke claim was clean. Amos Rourke had held the property free of encumbrance. The county had acquired it properly at tax auction, when Rourke ceased paying taxes, and Mora's purchase from the county was correctly documented and properly registered. There were no gaps, no competing claims, no ambiguities. Grief could exploit through a title challenge. "The title is sound," Vance wrote. "What he can do if he chooses is challenge the adequacy of the original tax auction process. There are historical precedents for this, though they are weak and expensive to pursue. My recommendation is to ensure all your tax payments on this property are current and made on record, so there is no opening there. I've also registered a formal notice of your legal representation with the county recorder's office. This makes clear to any party seeking to take action on this property that they will be dealing with counsel and not directly with you." Mara paid the annual property tax on Whitlock, holed in person at the county recorder's office in Meridian on a Thursday morning in June, standing at the counter and watching the clerk stamp the receipt, and she held that receipt in both hands for a moment before she folded it and put it in her jacket. The Delano chimney job took 4 days. She rebuilt the fireback from the ground up, relining the firebox, correcting the throat geometry that had been wrong in the original construction. The original builder had set the smoke shelf at the wrong depth, which was why the flue had always drawn poorly even before the crack developed. She fixed the underlying problem rather than just the presenting one, which cost her an extra day and the Delanos an additional fee that she quoted honestly, and they accepted. On the last day, when she was finishing the pointing on the new fireback, Nathan Delano, a man in his 40s who'd watched her work without interfering, which she'd appreciated, came and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My grandfather," she said. "Gideon Whitlock." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew Gideon. Not well, but I knew who he was." He looked at the rebuilt firebox. He'd recognized this work. She finished the pointing without responding to that because she didn't trust her voice to stay level if she did. Word traveled the way. Word traveled in a territory like this, not through newspapers or announcement, but through the specific and efficient network of people who talked to each other about practical things. A chimney rebuilt correctly. A foundation pointed so that the seeping stopped. The young woman from Blackthorn Ridge, who'd rebuilt the Rourke claim shelter with her own hands over a single season, and who now came down the mountain and did the kind of structural work that usually required sending to Meridian. By July, she had 3 more jobs. By August, she had 6. She didn't take all of them. She assessed each one on the merits what the problem actually was, whether she could solve it correctly rather than approximately how the work fit into the rhythm of what she was maintaining on the ridge. She turned down 2 jobs where the problem was structural in a way that required either engineering she couldn't be certain of or materials she couldn't source correctly in the time frame. Turning down work was something Gideon had taught her by example. He'd said on the one occasion she'd asked him directly, "If you take a job you can't do well, you've damaged 2 things, the client's structure and your own name. The name lasts longer than any single paycheck." She thought about this every time she walked away from a job that wasn't right. Most of its windows were dark. The money she earned from the chimney and foundation work she kept in a separate account from Amos Fork's savings. She was rigorous about this, keeping them conceptually and practically distinct. Amos's savings had built the shelter and defended it. Her earnings were something else, the first evidence that what Gideon had put into her could sustain her going forward without the extraordinary gift of someone else's 31 years. This distinction mattered to her in a way she found difficult to articulate but didn't try to resolve. It was simply true that the 2 accounts were different things, and she treated them as such. Rauch came back in September with a final offer of $1,200. She was remortaring the gap she'd found in the north wall during the spring thaw when he arrived. Working from the top of a rough scaffold she'd built from the timber offcuts, a ledger board supported on iron pins, she'd driven into the mortar joints at working height. She came down the scaffold when she heard him and stood on the ground with mortar on her hands and her trowel in one hand and looked at him. He looked tired. The professional pleasantness was still there, but it had a quality of effort about it now, the maintenance of a demeanor that had been maintained for a long time across a number of unproductive conversations. $1,200, he said. My employer's final figure. She looked at him. She thought about the number. Not about whether to accept it. That was not a question she needed to think about, but about what it represented. $1,200 was a real sum. It was enough to begin again, somewhere more comfortable. It was enough to live on for several years if she was careful. It was also approximately a third of what Fenn's assessment had valued the property at. And it was a figure that would give Aldous Grief access to a copper formation of substantial depth. And it's put Amos Rourke's shelter back into the hands of someone who would use it as a financial instrument rather than a home. No, she said. Rauch closed his eyes for a brief moment. Miss Whitlock, I've given you my answer through proper legal channels 3 times, she said. I've declined in writing twice through my solicitor. This visit is the 4th time. The answer hasn't changed, and it's not going to. She looked at him steadily. Your employer can keep his property to the north, and I'll keep mine. And we can both have what we have without the rest of this. He looked at her for a long moment. He won't give up, he said. Not as a threat, almost as information. The honest statement of a man who had worked for Aldous Grief long enough to know what he would and wouldn't do. I know, Mara said. But what he'll get is the same answer every time, and eventually the cost of getting that answer will exceed whatever value he's projecting from this parcel, and he'll move on to something else. She looked at him. He's a patient man. So am I. Rauch put his hat on. She had the sense in that moment that he was not entirely sorry to be delivering a declined offer. That the particular kind of work he'd been doing on this ridge, making repeated professional trips up a mountain to deliver unwanted proposals to a woman who kept declining them clearly and without drama, had perhaps begun to strike him differently over time. She couldn't be sure of this, but it was in his face. Something. He went down the trail. She went back up the scaffold. She was finishing the north wall gap when she heard the trail again. Not Rauch, back someone else, and she knew by the sound of the stride before she looked. The specific, careful placement of each step, the weight distribution of a man managing his knees on a descent, which translated in reverse on an ascent to the same careful economy. Dr. Pike came over the rise with his doctor's bag and the same weathered coat and the same gray eyes. She came down the scaffold. You didn't send word this time, she said. I didn't need to, he said. I was coming regardless. He looked at the scaffold, at the mortar work, at the completed kitchen garden wall, visible around the south corner of the shelter, at the woodshed, at all of it, the way he looked at things without sentimentality, but with genuine attention. How's the hip, he said. Good. Haven't needed the salve in 2 months. He nodded. He looked at her hands, at the mortar staining, at the callus pattern that had changed again since February, harder on the dominant palm, a new thickening at the base of the trowel fingers. You've been working, he said, which was his way of saying something more than those 3 words contained. Yes. He came inside. She made coffee, real coffee. She'd stopped rationing it months ago. She was buying it with her own earnings now, and it was one of the small luxuries she'd allowed herself without apology. He sat at the table and looked at the wooden sparrow on the hearthstone. Is that Nell Rourke's bird? He said. She looked at him. You know about it? Calder mentioned the box and the letter. He looked at the sparrow. Amos Rourke was in this territory before my time, but his name was still talked about when I arrived. People remembered him as a man who had bad luck and handled it with more dignity than most could have. He picked up the sparrow and turned it over in the way she did, feeling the grain. He left this here on purpose. For someone who needed it, she said. Pike set the bird back on the hearthstone. How are you, Mara? He asked. Not the clinical version of the question, the other one. She sat down across from him. I'm working, she said. I have 6 jobs this season, and I'm declining ones that aren't right, which feels right even when it cost money. The property's stable. Grief's last offer was $1,200, and I declined it, and I think he's running out of patience to sustain the approach. She paused. My hands are permanently different. My knees are fine. My hip is better. I talk to a carved wooden bird sometimes, which I'm aware is strange. Pike looked at her over his coffee cup. It's not that strange, he said. People talk to things that represent what they've lost. It's a way of keeping the connection without requiring the impossible thing, which is the person's actual presence. He set the cup down. Nell Rourke was 6 years old. She called the bird Pip. Amos kept it for 30 years before he left it for you. The bird has been talked to before. Mara looked at the sparrow. She'd thought about Nell Rourke a great deal over the winter. About what it meant to be 6 years old on a mountain with parents who had brought you there because they were trying to build something. About the fever that had taken Clara and then taken Nell 11 days later. About Amos who had stayed for 3 more years, because leaving felt like a second abandonment. She'd built a kitchen garden wall on the same ground where Nell Rourke had lived and died. She'd rebuilt the hearth where Clara Rourke had cooked. She'd sealed the walls and roofed the structure and made it something a family could have lived in, not just survived in. It wasn't grief exactly, what she felt about the Rourkes. It was something more like obligation, a word that could sound heavy but didn't feel heavy, the way some obligations don't. It felt like the right weight for something that mattered. Raymond came in October. She saw him from the south window, not his face first, but his walk, which she'd known her whole life. The specific gait of Raymond Whitlock, most of its windows were dark, which had always had something apologetic about it in the way that certain people carry their guilt in their stride long before they're able to say what they're sorry for. She stood inside for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it and stood in the doorway. He came over the rise and saw her and stopped. He looked at the shelter, at the rebuilt walls and the cedar roof and the lean-tos and the woodshed and the kitchen garden and the new scaffold along the north face. He looked at all of it with the face of a man who had expected something and found something else. He looked at Mara. She saw the moment he registered how she stood, not defensive, not braced, just standing in her doorway in the home she'd built, with mortar on her hands and her weight settled and her chin level. The way a person stands in a place that belongs to them. Mar, he said. Pa, she said. The word came out neutral, not warm, not cold, accurate. He came across the clearing. He looked around, up close, at the craftsmanship in the repointed joints, the fit of the door, the mortar in the scaffold section she'd been working on. His eyes moved over it, the way a person's eyes move over something they're trying to understand. I heard what you've done, he said. Harlan told me. Then Etta, then everyone, eventually. She said nothing. I heard about the geological situation, he said. About Grief's offers. I declined them. He looked at the structure. Harlan said you've been doing chimney and foundation work around the territory. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the ground and then looked at her, and she saw him working up to something, the way people work up to things they should have said a long time ago and know it, and are ashamed of the gap. I was wrong, he said. What I did. What I let Lenora, he stopped. Started again. What I did, not just Lenora. Me, what I chose. He looked at her steadily, and in his eyes she saw, for the first time in a long time, something that was not careful discomfort. It was plain grief. I've been wrong for years. Since your mother. Maybe before. I let the people in front of me make decisions that were mine to make, because it was easier than he stopped again. It's not an excuse. I know that. Mara stood in the doorway. She thought about $17 and a cracked leather pouch. About a piece of paper slid across a kitchen table like a receipt for a life no longer wanted. About the walk north in the dark with Gideon's tools on her back, and the summit at dawn and the sound of the hollow stone when she tapped it. She thought about what it would mean to say she forgave him, and whether she did, and what the word even meant, applied to something this large. She didn't know if she forgave him. She thought that might be something that took more time than she'd had, and that pretending to certainty she didn't have would be a kind of lie, and she'd spent too much of the last year in contact with bedrock truth to start with lies now. Come inside, she said. He came in. He sat at the table. She made coffee. He looked at the hearth, at the sparrow, at the shelves which were fully stocked now, flour and beans and preserved meat and dried fruit and sisson and tools and seed packets for next year's garden, at the floor she'd planed and the furniture she'd built, and the light from the south window falling across the pine. You built all of this, he said. Yes, Gideon's tools? Yes. He looked at his hands on the table, which were the hands of a man who had not done much physical work in recent years, soft compared to hers, the skin undamaged. He'd be Raymond started. I know, Mara said. They sat in silence for a while. It was not a comfortable silence. It was not supposed to be. But it was honest, and honesty was what she had to offer for him. And she thought, looking at him across the table, that honest discomfort was more respectful than comfortable dishonesty. She asked about Lenora. He said they'd left Benson Creek and gone further east. The way he said, it told her something about the state of that household that she didn't press. She asked nothing else about Lenora. When he left late in the afternoon, needing to make the valley before dark, he stood at the top of the trail and looked back at the shelter one more time. Whitlock Hold, he said. He'd seen the address on Calder's latest delivery. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she couldn't fully name, and she didn't try. It was his to carry. All right, he said. Right, she said. He went down the trail. She watched him go, the way she watched everyone go, at the top of the ridge, the wind in her hair, until the trail curved and they were gone. Then she turned back to the shelter. She went back up the scaffold and picked up her trowel and went back to the north wall gap she'd been working on when Rauch arrived. The mortar she'd mixed that morning was still workable if she moved efficiently, and the late afternoon light was still good, and the section she was working was small enough to finish before dark if she didn't waste time. She worked until the light went. She came down the scaffold in the dusk and stood in the clearing and looked at the section she'd finished. The joints were tight and clean, and the surface was correctly tooled, a slight concavity to each joint that directed water out rather than in. In 10 years, if someone pressed those joints with a thumb, they'd find them solid. She went inside. She washed her hands in the basin. She put wood on the fire. She sat at the table with the lamp and the account pages from the metal box, and she added the day's work to the record, not the emotion of it, not Raymond's visit or Rauch's final offer, or the feeling of Pike's question, how are you? Mara landing somewhere real. Just the facts. The north wall section completed, materials used, time spent. Then she folded the account page and put it back in the box, and she held Amos Rourke's letter for a moment without opening it. She'd read it enough times to know it entire and set it back. She picked up Nell Rourke's wooden sparrow. She set it on the table in front of her, where the lamplight that caught the grain, and she looked at it for a while. She had come up this mountain with $17 and old tools and nowhere else to go, and she had spent $15 on something an entire town considered worthless. And she had worked through a full year of seasons, the burning summer labor, the cold fall calculations, the winter isolation, the spring planting, and what she had at the end of it was not what anyone watching from below would have predicted. Not comfort, not ease, not the resolution of every difficulty. She had work she could do and knew how to price. She had a property that was worth defending and the legal architecture to defend it. She had neighbors improbable, self-selected, unglamorous neighbors, a widow who climbed mountains with pies, a freight driver who said 40 words an hour and made them count, a doctor who knew about bursitis and loneliness in equal measure, a hardware man who'd verified her rope ratings and shown up unasked with a rafter square. She had a kitchen garden beginning its second season. She had the account page, which was the record of how Amos Rourke's 31 years had been honored rather than spent. She had Gideon's voice, still there, still reliable, check the load path, check the mortar, don't cut the notch until you've measured it 4 times. She had the mountain, which had never pretended to be anything other than what it was difficult, unaccommodating, indifferent to what she weighed or what her stepmother thought of her, or whether her father had courage. The mountain had simply presented the terrain and let her decide what to do with it, which was the most honest relationship she'd had with anything. She put the sparrow back on the hearthstone. She looked at the fire for a while. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed in the warm room she'd built on the east side of the shelter she'd rebuilt on the ridge she'd climbed with $17 and a canvas bag. And she slept without dreaming, the way people sleep when they are tired from work they chose, and are lying in the consequence of their own decisions, which is one of the few unambiguous forms of rest that actually exists. This outside Blackthorn Ridge was dark and still. The smoke from Whitlock Hold's chimney went straight up into the cold, clear sky, the way it had gone up all winter, the way it would go up through whatever winter came next. Not because the mountain had decided to be kind to her, but because she had built something that held.